Age of Exploration. The Age of Exploration is also referred to as the Age of Discovery. And this was a period that lasted from the early 15th century to the 17th century. So from the early 1400s into the 1600s. And during this time, there were many major developments, and those included advances in navigation, map making, and shipbuilding. And with advances in all three of these, people were able to travel further. If they had better navigation, they would be able to find where they were trying to go faster and get further. Better maps were going to get them places more accurately. They could keep going beyond the map and trying to map out more of the world so that people could go further. Shipbuilding, with better ships, they were able to travel further away from land. Now, these advances led Europe to expand its exploration of the rest of the world. So Europe knew its surrounding areas, but it wanted to branch out further. It wanted to see what else was out there. So explorers set out from many countries in Europe, including Spain, Portugal, France, and England. And other countries joined in later, but these were the ones who were involved more in the 15th century, and from the very beginning. They all had a higher interest in exploring what else was out there than some of the other countries. Once the other countries saw the benefits that these countries were reaping from their exploration, then the other countries started to join in as well. So, what these people were searching for first, the explorers, they were seeking new routes to Asia. There was a lot of trade to be had with Asia. After the fall of Constantinople, the land route was either wiped out or not very easy to get across anymore, and so they were looking for a different route to get there. And they discovered a new route. They discovered a new route to get to India and beyond, around the southern tip of Africa. So they methodically sailed down the coastline of Western Africa and mapped it out. And eventually they came to the tip and realized they started going north again. And then they realized they could get to India from going that way, and then they kept going further and further east, and they got into different parts of Asia. So they did find a new route as they were looking for. They also discovered the New World, which is what they used to refer to the Americas. So North and South America, and North and South America were referred to as the New World, because whenever people started sailing west, thinking they'd eventually go around in a circle and come to the east, and they'd get to the Indies, which is what they were calling Asia at the time, they thought they would make it there. They didn't know about these other two continents in the way. So they ran into the New World, which is what they called the Americas. They also discovered Australia. So in their ventures beyond the southern tip of Africa, they discovered Australia, and then New Zealand, and even Hawaii. So these are all continents and islands that are in the middle of the water. Kind of in the middle of the water, just really big pieces of land in the middle of the water that Europe didn't know about before. And so during this age of discovery, this age of exploration, Europe discovered all of these places, and all of this discovery led to an increase in trade. They discovered lots of new foods, new metals, new valuable things from these other places that they could ship back home to Europe and then trade with other countries. So there was an increase in trade. There was also an increase in colonization. So once Europe found these places, they wanted to start sending people to colonize those areas. And sometimes there were people already living in these areas, and so their colonization wasn't always welcome, and it wasn't always a positive thing for the place that they found. So, for instance, upon coming to the New World, to the Americas, there were already indigenous people living there. The Native Americans were living there. And whenever the Europeans came in, they brought new diseases with them, which wiped out a huge chunk of the population because those people had never been exposed to those diseases before. And they also forced the native people to give up areas that they wanted. So if the Europeans came in and said, we want to live here, and there were already Native Americans living there, they kicked them out. And then if they stayed in the same area, they tended to force rules on them and force their religions onto them. So it wasn't exactly a good thing for the places that Europe was exploring and discovering, but it did lead to more trade, colonization, and more of a connection between all of the different continents, because now they are discovering all of them where they didn't know about them before. And Russia was also involved in the age of exploration, but they didn't go that far. They explored and conquered most of Siberia. So where Europe, the rest of Europe, was sending ships out and finding new places in the middle of water, Russia stayed on land and conquered most of Siberia, so Russia turned into a huge country at that time. So the age of exploration lasted from the 15th century to the 17th century, and it involved Europe setting forth into the world and discovering places that had yet to be discovered. English exploration of the New World. The English lagged somewhat behind other European nations in exploration of the New World. Finally, however, a combination of economic and social incentives convinced them to look west. So for a long time, England wasn't particularly interested in expansion, where other European nations were. So while Spain and France were more involved in colonization and exploration, England wasn't for a while. They lagged behind. But then they decided that it would be in their best interest to explore the New World on their own. And let's look at a few of the reasons that there was this new interest in the New World. For one thing, the enclosure movement in England had made land very scarce. And the practice of primogeniture meant that only the eldest son could inherit the land. For these reasons, many Englishmen moved to the New World for the promise of cheap land. So let's look at this. For one thing, the enclosure movement in England made land very scarce. England had been divided up to where there were big open pieces of land known as the commons, and people could grow crops there, and the land didn't really belong to anyone. If you lived on the land, you didn't own it, but you could grow crops on it and then take that food for yourself. But the enclosure movement started to enclose parts of these commons, and once they were enclosed in a fence, they belonged to someone, usually a wealthy landowner or a noble. And once the land was enclosed, not just anyone could farm it anymore. And many of the people who owned land chose to grow the sheep business, because many people wanted the wool from sheep in England, and that was a big trade item for England at that time. So instead of using the land for agriculture, they would use it as grazing land for sheep and sometimes other cattle, but primarily sheep, because the wool was very valuable at that time. So as more land was taken up, that sent people who had lived on the land and farmed on it, but now it wasn't common anymore. They couldn't live there. They had to leave. And so there were this landless class of people, and they went to go work in the bigger cities and kind of fueled the Industrial Revolution as the workers for that. But they had to change their living. So this enclosure movement made land very scarce. Only people who owned land now could live on that land because it almost all the commons had been enclosed. There wasn't land for people to just live on anymore. And the practice of primogeniture is the practice of letting your oldest son inherit everything. So only the oldest son could inherit the land of his father. So any younger sons and any daughters would have to look elsewhere. The daughters would have to marry people who already had land, or they would be out of luck. And the younger sons wouldn't inherit any land, so they could maybe live on the same land if their brother let them, or they'd have to go find work or a home elsewhere. So these practices made it very easy for Englishmen to say, you know what, I'll go to the New World. There's plenty of land there, and so I can get cheap land and have my own land and my own home, grow my crops, let cattle live there, raise sheep if I want to, but they could own their own land, which was not something that anybody was able to do in England. Only people who had land right away and then inherited it as the movement continued generation to generation. Let's look at another incentive. England also had a large population at this time. So you have this large population with the enclosure movement going on and sending people into the cities. That was going to mean that your urban areas were going to be somewhat overpopulated, and the government viewed the New World as a good place to send criminals and beggars. They didn't have enough prisons to hold the criminals. They didn't want to have to feed the criminals. They didn't want to have to take care of the beggars and make sure they were fed or give them somewhere to live. So they shipped them off to the New World to live there or to work there. And there they may have gotten land of their own. They may have done better than they had in England with new resources available and kind of a fresh start. But in any case, that was a solution to England's population problem at that time. And another reason for the increase in interest in America was the Protestant Reformation. You had all the reformers during this time. And people who were reforming from Catholicism and kind of breaking away from that faith and saying, we can talk to God ourselves, we can read the Bible ourselves, we don't need the priests to do this for us. Those people were considered Protestants. They were breakaways from the Catholic Church. And then you had England, who decided to form the Church of England. King Henry VIII said, I'm going to make my own church. I will be the head of it. This is the Church of England. So you had English Catholics who were solid Catholics and wanted to hold true to the Catholic Church and to the Pope and to Rome, and they didn't agree with the Church of England. And then you had Protestants who also didn't agree with the Church of England, because the Church of England had broken away from the Catholic Church, but they weren't 100% reformed to where they were saying, oh, everyone can read this. Oh, you can talk to God yourself. We're not going to function like the Catholic Church did. The Church of England was still similar, or more similar at least, to the Catholic Church than to the Protestant churches that were popping up. So Protestants didn't feel comfortable with the Church of England. English Catholics who were holding strong to the Catholic faith didn't feel comfortable with the Church of England, and they felt alienated by it. Sometimes even persecuted if they didn't agree with the Church of England precisely. And they wanted to find a place where they could worship more freely. So rather than continue to be alienated or persecuted for their faith, they immigrated to the New World and could start a new life there, start their own churches, have more freedom of religion there. So at first, England lagged behind in exploration of the New World, but with these economic and social incentives, they finally realized the value of exploring America for themselves. English colonization of the New World. The first English attempt to found a colony in the New World was made by Sir Humphrey Gilbert in Newfoundland in 1583. and it was a complete failure. So, the first English attempt at a colony in the New World did not succeed. Then, Sir Walter Raleigh led 2 more failed attempts at founding a colony on Roanoke Island in 1586 and 1588. So in 1586, he tried, that colony failed. In 1588, he set up another colony, and the second of these colonies, the 1588 one, is known as the Lost Colony, because it disappeared without a trace while Raleigh was gone. So you may have heard about Roanoke before, and it was the second colony set up at Roanoke, but this one, no one knows what happened to it. Raleigh left it, it was functioning smoothly, he came back, everything was gone, all the people were gone without a trace. There's no note, there's nothing, they couldn't find bodies or remains to see if something had happened to them. So there are a lot of different ideas about what happened to them, if they just wandered off somewhere, if they were taken by Indians, if they had to leave for some kind of environmental reason, or because the Indians drove them away, and it was so quick that they didn't have time to say anything or write a note for Sir Walter Raleigh whenever he returned. But in any case, he came back, and there were no more people from his settlement. It was just completely vacated with no trace of any of them. So it is known as the Lost Colony. So that would be a third failed attempt at setting up a colony in the New World for England. Finally, the British were able to establish a permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. And King James was the king at this time, King James I, and so they named this settlement after him, Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. So it took a while. We had 1583, it failed, one in 1586, one in 1588, both at Roanoke Island. Those both failed. And then finally in 1607, we had a permanent one. Now it still had trials. It wasn't easy for these people. They started out in an area that was kind of marshy, had a lot of standing water, and so they had to deal with mosquitoes and the malarial conditions. And they also had to deal with the Native Americans that lived in that area. At first, the Native Americans helped them, but eventually the English people started trying to take too much by force, and there was a lot of violence that ensued. So more people died than survived the first few years of this colony, and supply ships had to keep coming in with more colonists and more supplies until finally there were enough people and supplies there to maintain a steady settlement. So this was a settlement that succeeded, but it was very close to a failure itself. The settlers in Jamestown came for gold, so they came for riches. They thought they could find some wealth over in the New World and to convert the natives to Christianity. So some came as missionaries. And one of the most important events of the early years of Jamestown was the issuing of the Virginia Charter. And the Virginia Charter was important because it declared that English settlers in the New World would be treated as Englishmen with full English rights. So even though they weren't in England, they were still treated like Englishmen, and they were still given the same rights as the people living in England. So this is important. It wasn't saying that the people who were living in Virginia or living in the colony of Jamestown were any less than the Englishmen living in England. It was telling them, you are still considered English citizens of a sort. You are still Englishmen, you still have full English rights, but you're over across the ocean. So it was just a different colony, but it still was supposed to be part of England, with the settlers there still maintaining all of their English rights. So England had already lagged behind in exploration of the New World, and their first few attempts at a settlement were failures, and that was kind of a setback an additional setback for England, but eventually, after several years of trying, in 1607 a permanent settlement was established at Jamestown, Virginia.
The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown. Now, Jamestown was established in North America. And its establishment date was the year 1607. Now, Jamestown was named after King James I of England. Now, there were a few contributing factors that led to the establishment of Jamestown. Now, one of these factors was the idea that England and Spain, during that period of time in history, were rival military European powers. For the first time, by 1607, England and Spain was experiencing a period of peace. Also, another factor was the idea that the Virginia Company was providing the financial support and the willing settlers. Now, the Virginia Company was a private corporation. That meant that they were putting up the investment. They were shouldering the cost, not the English crown or the English taxpayers. And they were responsible for promoting the settlers to come to Jamestown. Now, it's important to note that the settlers were being lured to Jamestown by the Virginia Company by the idea of experiencing adventure, exercising religious freedom, and these settlers had the idea that they could continue as English subjects in North America. So, we have the first permanent English settlement in North America is Jamestown. It was settled in 1607, and it was settled because you had some very important factors contributing to its establishment. There was peace between England and Spain. You had a private corporation, the Virginia Company, that was providing the money and promoting and luring settlers to Jamestown. And these settlers were willing to come to Jamestown because they had the idea of meeting and experiencing adventure, having religious freedom, and continuing, even in North America, as English subjects.
The original 13 colonies were started by settlers from England. Now, these people came to the New World for many reasons. So we can basically classify their different reasons into three main categories. And so this first category is political ideology. Second category is economic prospects. And a third category is social change. So there were many reasons people could come to the New World, but we're going to look at a few of the main ones. So with political ideology, this is basically your idea of how politics or government should run. Basically, what is the role of government? And so people wanted to be under a different political ideology, and so they hoped to have a new society here in the New World, different than the one in England, maybe even a new government. And so kind of the idea here is that you come to the New World, and so you're no longer really under the reign of England. But what ended up happening is, even though they were in the New World, they were still under the reign of England, and they still had to pay taxes. And what happened is that England began to impose more and more taxes on the settlers. And the settlers in the New World weren't able to vote, and so they didn't have representation in British Parliament. So that's where the phrase taxation without representation came from. And so even though they came to the New World hoping for a new society, they ended up having to pay a lot of taxes to England and becoming very disgruntled with the English government. Now, of course, after the U.S. signed the Declaration of Independence and declared their freedom from England, they no longer had to pay those taxes. But I doubt that the people came here wanting a new society thought that a war was going to have to take place in order to form that new society. I'm sure they probably wanted it to come about in a more peaceable manner. A second category is economic prospects. And so companies wanted to own more land in order to increase profits. So there's a number of ways they can increase profits by having land in the New World. But one thing you have to realize is that if you look at a world map, the New World was huge compared to England. Even the 13 colonies were a lot bigger than England. And so there was a lot of land to be had in the New World. And so companies wanted a stake of that. And then individuals as well saw profits in things like farming tobacco, because tobacco was something that you couldn't find in Europe. And so they thought maybe they could grow tobacco in the New World and export it to Europe. Then a third reason is social change. And the main reason for social change was a desire for religious freedom. Some people wanted to worship in their own way and not have to be told how to worship by the English government, so they headed to the New World. And so this was a really big reason, as well as these other reasons, and there's probably smaller reasons I didn't touch on here of why people wanted to come to the New World, maybe just for a sense of adventure. But these are all basically the main reasons people came to the New World. And so if you're trying to really sum up why the New World was founded, you could sum it up with these main points.
Slavery in the English colonies. Between 1640 and 1660, the Southern colonies slowly evolved from a system of servitude to one of slavery. And that meant while the Southern colonists did have people working for them, they weren't doing it for nothing. They weren't slaves, but that slowly changed. At first, Native Americans or indentured servants from England were used as laborers, but eventually most of the labor was performed by African slaves. So what that means is that the Native Americans would help perform the labor of working on these large plantations or farms, and they would get something in trade. It may not have been very much, but they were getting something. Indentured servants would come over from England with the understanding that they would work for someone for so many years, and then they would be free to go off and do what they wanted. They were basically paying for their passage from England to America by working it off. So they were indentured servants. They were obligated to keep working for this person for so many years, whatever was agreed upon, to earn their, not freedom, but to work off what the cost was or what they had agreed would be the cost to transport this person from England to America in the first place. So there was a trade of sorts going on there. But eventually, most of the labor was performed by African slaves, people who were taken from Africa and forced to work for nothing. These slaves were taken in wars between African chieftains and then sold to European traders. So the Africans didn't have allegiance to each other as a continent or as one united nation. There were several different groups of Africans. There were different tribes, and so each one had a chief, and these different chiefs or chieftains would fight amongst each other. And so whenever one group would win, they would take the losers as hostages and sell them to European traders to be slaves. Oftentimes, the African leaders would trade slaves for guns to protect themselves from other slave traders. So if one group had guns, they were likely to beat most of the other groups of Africans, and they would then win and not be sold themselves into slavery. So it ended up, for some people, being basically a means to not become slaves themselves, but several African states, most notably the Yoruba and Dahomey, became wealthy from this trade. So they weren't doing it simply to survive and not to be taken as a slave themselves, but they were doing it for profit. So the African tribes had turned on each other and given each other up to the Europeans because they didn't have allegiance to each other as Africans. They had allegiance to their own tribe. And so as those tribes fought and one was conquered, the losing tribe would, any surviving members of the losing tribes would be sold or traded to the Europeans to be slaves in the New World. Now, the journey from West Africa to the West Indies was dangerous and depressing. This was not an easy journey, and many slaves died en route. Now, going from West Africa, they were going to stop off in the British West Indies, and they were going to have to work there for a while before they would be shipped on to America, to the Southern Colonies. So only about half of the slaves actually arrived alive in America that were shipped from West Africa. In 1661, Virginia became the first colony to legalize chattel slavery for life. And this meant that it was now law that children of slaves would be slaves as well. In order to justify this hateful institution, slave owners declared that blacks were less than human, or that as descendants of the biblical figure Ham, they were ordered by God to serve whites. Now, this was some twisted logic, and it didn't make sense to a lot of people, but to a lot of people who needed the workers, they used this to justify it to themselves. So the African slaves were considered less than human, and they were sold like livestock. And much as if you owned 2 cows that bred and had a calf, if you owned 2 slaves that had children, those children also became your slaves. So Virginia was the first colony to legalize that chattel slavery for life, which meant that the slave was yours as long as they were alive, and any offspring they produced would also be yours for as long as they lived. And there were different justifications that people used for this, but it was basically a justification so they could have free labor and have a greater profit. The number of slaves increased dramatically in the 1680s after the Royal African Company lost its monopoly and the industry was thrown open to anyone. So for a long time, the Royal African Company was the group of European traders that would take the slaves from West Africa and transport them to America. But they lost their monopoly in the 1680s, and the market was open to anyone. So anyone could go in and try to pick up a boatload of slaves and bring them to America for a profit. Virginia established slave codes to keep revolts down. So naturally, these people who had been free in Africa, who had already lost most of their tribe, if not been separated from all of their tribe after being conquered and traded by other African tribes to these Europeans, they may have seen some of their family members die in the ships on the way to America from Africa or die in the British West Indies while working there. So they had seen a lot already and they were not happy. So the people in Virginia came up with these slave codes that were like laws the slaves had to abide by and that all white people would make sure the slaves abided by to keep revolts down. Because if the slaves were allowed to join together and discuss their problems and kind of educate themselves, then they might overthrow the system and that would take away this free source of labor. So slaves could not be taught to read. They weren't going to be able to read. They couldn't educate themselves. They couldn't see what was being written about them, and they couldn't then write either to be able to try to plead with people far away, write letters to get help from other places. That avenue was closed to them. They could not gather together. If you don't let the slaves get in a group, then they can't form a revolt group together. There won't be a revolution if the slaves can't get together. So they weren't allowed to gather together. They may all work in the same field together, but they weren't allowed to gather on their own. They could not have weapons. They shouldn't have weapons because the slave holders were in charge. They were the ones who should be wielding any weapons. No slave should have weapons because then they could rebel and maybe use that weapon against their master. And slaves could not leave the plantation without written permission. So if a slave was to maybe have to run an errand down the road for their master, they were going to have written permission to make sure that they weren't mistaken for a slave trying to escape or do something wrong. So they would have to present this written permission to anyone that saw them along the way and wondered what this slave was doing out on their own. So they weren't allowed to leave without written permission. So there were a lot of rules in place to keep the slaves down and to try to keep them from coming together to join and form a revolt. Naturally, slaves often rebelled against their treatment. So obviously, they weren't all just going to say, okay, we'll follow all these rules, we'll work for you for free, you can do whatever you want, it's fine. They weren't going to do that, especially people who had come straight over from Africa and had been free before and now were slaves. So they rebelled against their treatment, but they were outnumbered and overpowered. There were way more white people and there were way more people who were in positions of power where the slaves were not. And many slaves resisted submission and many died as a result. So the ones who did try to revolt, who did rebel against their masters, ended up being killed as a punishment. And in fact, for any serious offense, a slave would be executed in front of his or her peers as a deterrent. The slaveholders figured, hey, if we show these slaves what happens to slaves who behave badly, they won't do this either. So they would execute the slaves who committed any serious offenses in front of the rest of the slaves that they owned so that they would see what happened to bad ones and it would deter the rest of the slaves from following in the executed slaves' footprints. However, there was white resistance to slavery from the very beginning. Many people were for slavery. Many people saw the value in it. They saw this free source of labor. They saw their plantations needed to be tended to somehow, and it would cut into their profit to have to pay people. So yes, they wanted to use these free slaves. You only had to pay for slaves once whenever you bought them. And then with these chattel slavery laws in place, they would produce more slaves for you. So you had a good return on your investment, and you didn't have to pay someone forever or for their whole lifetime for their work. You just paid one time, and that was it. So many people were drawn to the idea of slavery, but there were still a lot of people who resisted slavery. White people who resisted slavery and who didn't think that this was right. They didn't think that one person should own another person or be able to control another person like that. In 1688, the Quakers declared that slavery was inhuman and a violation of the Bible. So it was against human nature that one human should own another, and they agreed that it was in violation of the Bible, that God would not like this to be happening, that contrary to what the people who used the biblical figure of Ham, who ordered, which story said that the black people were ordered by God to serve whites, the Quakers said, no, this is a violation of the Bible. The Bible says treat people the way you want to be treated, love your neighbor, help those in need. It doesn't say anything about owning someone else. And so the Quakers' interpretation was that this was not a good thing. It was actually a violation of the Bible, and it went against human nature. Many people felt that slavery degraded both master and slave. The fact that a person would think they could own another, and the fact that one person was being made to submit to another person completely like that, was a form of degradation, and that's the way that some people felt. And then the hymn, Amazing Grace, which I'm sure you've heard, was written by a guilt-racked former slave trader, John Newton. So John Newton had been a slave trader, but he reformed. He saw that this was not a good practice, and he felt so guilty about it that he came up with that song, Amazing Grace, that saved a wretch like me. He felt so bad about this practice, and he realized that slavery was bad and tried to make up for that. So there were a lot of people, a lot of white people, that didn't agree with slavery. Now, they were still in the majority, or they were still in the minority, and so the majority of people were for slavery, and so slavery existed, slavery continued, and slavery increased over the next several years because there wasn't anything to stop it. There was still plenty of land that needed to be tended, so crops could be grown and profits could be made. Slaves could only become free by proving mulatto or half-white status, or by buying their freedom. So if they proved that they had one white parent, that they were half-white, then they could be free. Sometimes, if people let them prove it, they could have proof, but if all the white people denied the proof, then that person probably still wasn't going to become free. But if people would recognize that a slave did have a white parent and was of mulatto status, then they would be free. Or they could buy their freedom. Some masters would allow their slaves to work for pay on the weekends. So they worked during the week for free, but they could work extra on the weekend, make some money, and if they saved up enough, they could buy their own freedom, maybe slowly buy the freedom of their family. And so some masters did say, okay, I can give back this little bit. I've paid for the slave. I've gotten plenty of work out of him. So now let him work some more and buy his freedom back from me. So some masters were a little more giving than others, but a lot of them weren't going to offer that option, and so it was very difficult for a slave to become free. So the English colonies started out with a system of servitude using Native Americans and indentured servants, where people were at least given something. There was some form of trade going on for their work, but it very quickly escalated to using African slaves, and the practice of slavery just kept growing and growing in the southern colonies until the issue escalated around the time of the Civil War.
The 13 colonies were colonies in North America under the rule of Britain. These colonies later made up the United States of America. The colonies were split up into 3 different sections. The New England colonies, which were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and the Middle colonies, which were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then finally, the southern colonies, which were Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Each colony had its own government, but the governments were also subject to Britain's government. Britain started putting taxes on the colonies, and people in the colonies referred to this as taxation without representation, because those in the colonies, even though they had a say in their colony government, did not have a say in Britain's government. So Britain was taxing those in the colonies, but those in the colonies had no say as to whether or not they were taxed and in what amount. So after some protests in 1775, the American War for Independence broke out, also called the American Revolutionary War, broke out to overthrow Britain's rule in the colonies and to allow the colonies to set up their own government. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. It was primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, and this was a letter to King George III, the King of Britain, to let him know that the colonies were removing from being under the rule of Britain and were setting up their own country. So 1776 is known as the year that the colonies became the United States of America.
The Southern Colonies. The Southern Colonies were Maryland, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And these were all colonies claimed by England, later called Great Britain. And they claimed these colonies whenever they were first trying to race to put colonies in North America so that they could have more colonial power than any of the other European powers, such as Spain or France. But these 5 colonies developed on their own and were able to become very powerful, very well-functioning colonies on their own. And since they grew, they kind of stuck around, or some of the other colonies fizzled out. And so these were the colonies known as the Southern Colonies because they were toward the southern end of England's colonial power. Of the Southern Colonies, Virginia was the first permanent settlement. Or the first permanent English colony. And Georgia was the last. Now this is of the Southern Colonies. There were middle and northern colonies as well, and so some of those may have happened in between when Virginia and Georgia were established. But out of the Southern Colonies, Virginia was the first permanent colony, or the oldest one, and Georgia would be the newest or youngest colony. Now, some of the reasons that they were able to grow and become very important, well-functioning communities on their own was because of their location. The warm climate, rich soil, and long growing season all led to a large agricultural economy. So they were able to grow what were known as cash crops. And their cash crops included rice, indigo, and tobacco. And these were crops that they were growing primarily to sell for cash, to make a profit on. The rice was very useful, they could use that, but no one needed indigo or tobacco. Those were things that were just nice. Having indigo to dye things, then it just made your clothes or blankets pretty. It wasn't something that was needed. Tobacco was something that people could do as a leisurely activity. It wasn't something that you needed. And so the rice, while people would actually eat that and use it and maybe need that as a form of sustenance, the rest of it wasn't so much. And so these were crops they grew a lot of, planning to sell most of it because they were cash crops and not crops that they just needed to be able to eat. Most land was controlled by wealthy plantation owners and farmers. So these plantation owners grew these cash crops and grew wealthy. Farmers maybe didn't have a whole plantation, but if they had a little farm of their own that they owned, then they could grow these cash crops and become wealthy as well, and maybe develop a plantation as they grew wealthier. Now, these plantation owners weren't actually doing the work themselves. The land was worked mostly by indentured servants and African slaves. And the first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619, which started a long, unpleasant history of slavery in the American colonies. So the indentured servants were people who came over and maybe said, okay, I'll work for you for 5 years on your plantation and then I'll be free. And so the plantation owner or the farmer would say, okay, you come over, you work on my land for 5 years, and then you'll be free. You can go do what you want to do. You can buy your own farm. You can try to save up some money, but you won't be indentured to me anymore. So that's what the indentured servants were. They set up an amount of time and said, okay, I'll work for you for this long, and then I'll have my freedom again. The African slaves were taken from Africa and forced into slavery, forced to work on these plantations. And so that is why it is an unpleasant history, because it was where people were just taken from their homes in another country and taken by ship to America to work in these fields, and they were forced to do so. And this was starting a long history of slavery in the American colonies up through it becoming the United States of America, and then through the Civil War when slavery ended. So from 1619 through the Civil War, that's when slavery started in America until when it ended. So the Southern colonies were 5 different colonies that were established by England, and they just happened to be in an area that was good for agriculture. And so people developed, and these cities grew, or these colonies grew into stable colonies and were permanent settlements instead of just colonies that fizzled out. And these 5 colonies became known as the Southern colonies. Southern colonies, an overview. In the early days of the Southern colonies, most people lived on small farms. And although they made up a tiny part of the population, the owners of the large coastal plantations wielded enormous power. So you had the poorer people living on small farms, and your wealthier people living along the coast in these large plantations, made wealthy by the large plantations, and kept wealthy by continually being able to grow crops on them. The small farms weren't going to make as much money for people. They were going to be available more as a means to live and maybe trade for a few other goods. These aristocrats that were the tiny percentage of the population that owned the large coastal plantations typically grew a single crop on their lands. So they had a lot of land, and they would usually grow a single crop to sell, and this would be known as a cash crop. Now, they may have also had little gardens around the house to grow other foods that they would eat. They may have had cattle or at least some livestock to help them supplement their diet, because they couldn't always eat what they grew. Some of the stuff they were growing wasn't so much for sustenance as it was to sell off. But they did grow a little bit of other stuff and have other food items available on the plantation. Now in North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland, tobacco was the cash crop. So that's what I meant by some of the crops weren't necessarily there for sustenance. You can't really eat tobacco. People chew it, but they smoked it, but they couldn't actually eat it. It couldn't sustain them. So they did have to grow at least a few other things on their land so they wouldn't have to trade for them. In South Carolina and Georgia, the large growers favored rice, which was something they could also eat, and indigo, which they could not. Plantations, like the feudal manors of the past, were almost totally self-sufficient units. And the feudal manors were the manors that were held during feudalism, where one lord would be the lord of a manor and own the lands around it, and that area would be pretty much self-sufficient. So much like England's feudal past, the colonies here had these plantations that were pretty much self-sufficient units. They grew a cash crop to make plenty of money, and that kept them wealthy, and they would grow a few other things to maintain their diet at home, and they may have some other animals living there or go out and hunt for the rest of it. But the owners still imported most of their luxury items from England. So there were some things that they weren't going to be able to provide for themselves, and that other plantations and small farms in the area weren't going to be producing. So they were going to need to get certain luxury items that weren't being made in the New World yet imported in from England. The southern colonies had the closest ties with England, mainly because England provided the market for their tobacco. Crops grown in the colonies were sold back in England by agents. So one of the reasons the southern colonies had the strongest ties to England were because they still traded primarily with England. Other people in America could grow tobacco, so that wasn't something that other people in America in the colonies were going to necessarily want to trade for. But people in England weren't able to grow it as well, and they wanted to trade for it. So that was their primary market, was over in England. And so the crops would be sent back to England and sold by agents in England, and then the agents would return for more of the crop and to give some of the profits back to the plantation owners, which is how they maintained their wealth. If they were growing certain crops like tobacco that their neighbors could also grow, they weren't going to have much of a market in America. Their market had to be in England. The social lives of the southern colonists were filled with dancing, card playing, cotillions, hunts. So they would hunt both for sport and because they could use the meat for food, and large community dinners. So everyone in the small farms were going to have to work pretty hard, but they did still have a pretty active social life, which dealt with the whole community kind of joining together for these events. So dancing would be pretty regular, card playing. Cotillions were a more formal and distinguished affair. It would be more of a big deal than just regular dancing. The cotillions, people would dress up really nicely and display their social graces and manners at these formal dances. And then the hunts and the large community dinners were a way for everyone to come together and hunt for a meal and then share the meal. Southerners were also considered to be very optimistic in temperament, which was in contrast to their more dour northern counterparts. So the people who lived in the northern colonies were said to have a more negative temperament than the people in the South. The people in the southern colonies seemed a little more lighthearted, more optimistic. They were having all these fun social activities, and they kept their spirits up. It was extremely difficult to move up in the social hierarchy in the South. So while there was a great deal of socializing going on, you may stay in your own social class and not really get to move up. If you're one of these small farmers, then you're probably going to socialize with the small farmers and not move up to socialize with the plantation owners. The plantation owners are pretty much going to socialize with their neighboring plantation owners. The wealthy colonists generally took the best land and thus were able to maintain their positions in the economy and the government. The wealthy people were going to have more say in the government, and they were also going to be a bigger influence in the economy. So by taking the best lands, they maintained their wealth and they maintained their social status by being involved in the economy and the government. The poor people had to move away from towns to find farmlands. So around a town, the land all near that town would probably already be claimed by other colonists, and people would have their own small farms there, or a town may be built near a big plantation where there's going to be a lot of people working. But in any case, the poor people were going to have to move away from that to find vacant farmland that they could start a farm for themselves. And because farming was the only available occupation, there were not any venues for ambitious men to distinguish themselves. So if you had a very ambitious young man who was born to one of the small farmers, then he probably wasn't going to get to move up to be a plantation owner, or to move up socially, or to be involved in the government. There wasn't a way for ambitious people to move up, because they were stuck in that same social stratification. So the poor people were pretty much going to stay with the other poor people, and that doesn't mean they had nothing. It just means that they had a smaller farm. They're basically growing crops to live, maybe have a little bit extra for some basic amenities, but they didn't have huge sprawling homes or farmlands like the plantations did. They didn't have the ability to get the luxury goods that the plantation owners did. And North Carolina was generally considered to be the colony with the least social stratification. So the differences between the poorer and wealthier groups of people in North Carolina weren't as great as the differences in some of the other southern colonies. So the southern colonies were primarily divided into small farms owned by the poorer people and large plantations along the coast owned by the wealthier people. And by being small farmers, they stayed in that cycle of being the poorer people owning the smaller farms. The people who had originally claimed those large coastal plots and formed the plantations remained wealthy because they had these large plantations to keep amassing wealth from. The southern colonies had stronger ties with England because England was their main market to sell their tobacco in. They didn't have a market for it in the colonies because other colonists could also grow tobacco, so they didn't need tobacco like the people in England did. And the southern colonies were filled with a lot of social activities to bring the community together. Overall, the southern colonies tended to have an optimistic attitude, which set them apart from their more dour or less optimistic northern counterparts.
By 1620, another North American settlement was being established in North America, and that settlement was known as the Plymouth Colony. Now, a significant contribution of the Plymouth Colony was the Mayflower Compact of 1620. Now, the Mayflower Compact of 1620 was the governing document of the Plymouth Colony. Now, the settlers who established the Plymouth Colony and what we know of today as Plymouth, Massachusetts, were called the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims traveled across the Atlantic from Europe on a ship named the Mayflower. And thus you have the name Mayflower Compact of 1620. So the Pilgrims who came to North America aboard the Mayflower, they created this document, the Mayflower Compact of 1620, to help them organize their community. Now, here's an important thing to note about European culture in the 1600s. Really, only adult males were considered full political beings, being that they were really the only ones in European society that could own land, vote, hold public office, or go into some type of serious contractual agreement. So what's important to note here about the Mayflower Compact of 1620 is that you had 41 Pilgrim men aboard the Mayflower, and all 41 of the adult males signed the compact. All of them signed the Mayflower Compact of 1620. Another thing here, why did the settlers, why did these pilgrims that came to the Plymouth colony, why did they even believe they needed a governing document like the Mayflower Compact? Well, very simple reason. The settlers knew that other European or English colonies that tried to establish in North America, they failed because they lacked a system of government. And what the Mayflower Compact of 1620 would provide is the basis for a strong, effective government. Now, the Mayflower Compact established a couple of major ideas. One is that this colony, the Plymouth colony, would be free from English rule. And because of this freedom from English rule and the idea of the Mayflower Compact of 1620, these colonists, the Pilgrims, would be self-governing. So you would have self-rule. These major ideas, the idea that being free from English rule back in England, east across the Atlantic Ocean, and also that you would have self-rule, rule in the colony, in the Plymouth colony, among the Pilgrims themselves, set into motion a few other things. Again, no allegiance to the King of England. And with this idea of self-rule, with this idea of a strong, effective governing document, like the Mayflower Compact of 1620, it sets into motion the idea of the American Revolution. And the American Revolution, for American independence to have self-rule, would occur about a century and a half later in 1776.
A representative government allows the people to choose who will represent them in governmental decisions. And that's exactly what happened in the 13 colonies. Each colony was given the opportunity to choose representatives. And this action is the mainstay of American democracy to this day. And so by the colonies choosing representatives, it set a precedent for the government all the way up until present-day America today, where we still choose representatives to represent us in government. Now, the colonists did not like the tariffs that were imposed upon them by King George III. And so in order to make sure they didn't have tariffs imposed upon them, they wanted a system of checks and balances. And so the last thing they wanted was to live under a system without checks and balances. So the colonists did not like the tariffs imposed upon them by King George III and did not want a system without checks and balances to occur in the colonies. And so with this representative setup, citizens could vote on candidates that would vote for them on the local, state, and federal level, since most citizens had other jobs to attend to. So the idea here is that you could set up a government where the citizens vote on every issue. So a bill comes up about a new tariff, and so all the citizens go to the polls and vote on that bill. But the easier thing to do is to vote on people who are going to represent you, that are going to deal with all of those issues, because people have to be able to focus on their own jobs to keep the economy running. And there's really just too many bills and too many government issues to be dealt with by the population as a whole. And so the responsibilities lie on people who are voted in by the citizens. And so a representative government allowed the colonists to keep the interests of the people in mind rather than impose laws produced by a monarchy. Because with a monarchy, that person is not voted in by the people. And so that candidate or that person in power does not have to answer to the people. But with a representative government, they're going to come back up for re-election. And so if they do not represent the interest of the people, then they may get voted out of office, which leads me to my next point. Representatives could be voted out of office if they do not represent the interest of the people. So a representative government promotes greater responsibility on the part of the government than does a monarchy, because they have to be able to please their constituents or please the people who vote for them. So what all of this did is allow colonists to have a means of control over tariffs and laws that affected their own lives, because with a monarchy they had no control. And so even though they weren't directly voting on tariffs and other laws that affected their lives, they were able to decide who did vote over those tariffs and other laws. Thomas Paine, King George III, and the Marquis de Lafayette all made interesting contributions and differing contributions to the American Revolution. So we'll start with Thomas Paine, who is also known as the father of the American Revolution. Thomas Paine is most well known for writing the pamphlet Common Sense. So this was basically a pro-independence pamphlet. So Thomas Paine wanted the colonies to break away from the rule of Great Britain. And so he used a new style of political writing to promote the American Revolution and democratic government, as well as denouncing British tyranny in the pamphlet Common Sense. And so that became very popular, and the Common Sense served as a rallying point for American revolutionaries. Now, King George III was king of Great Britain, and he was king of Great Britain during the time of the American Revolution, but he was also king before the American Revolution. And so he is cited by the colonists as the reason for the American Revolution, because he is heavily criticized in the Declaration of Independence. So I'm just going to write in D of I, in the Declaration of Independence. Because under his rule, heavy tariffs and taxes were imposed upon the colonists. And so when the colonists became disgruntled, they basically wrote the Declaration of Independence, which was a letter to King George III. Most people don't realize that the Declaration of Independence was a letter to him, basically informing him of their grievances against him. And then they declared independence, but King George III didn't want to let the colonists go, and so he waged war against the colonies. Because theoretically, when he heard that the colonies wanted to be free from the rule of Great Britain, he could have just let them go. But in this case, he made them fight for it. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette was a French military general. So it may be hard to understand how a French military general could be involved in the American Revolution, which was between the American colonies and Great Britain. I don't know why I wrote generally. I should have just written general. So he was a French military general, but he helped out in the American Revolution. So he served under George Washington. And so he was a general under Washington, and he was said to be a very good general. And he's most well known for containing British forces at the siege of Yorktown. So I'm just going to write here, contained British forces at Yorktown. So he contained these British forces, and that's important because he was able to keep them there long enough for reinforcements to arrive. And the British were defeated there, which ended the American Revolution, resulting in victory for the colonists. So that's Thomas Paine, King George III, the Marquis de Lafayette, and their contributions to the American Revolution.
The First and Second Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on September 5th, 1774. And it was made up of delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. So this Continental Congress was called when there was a lot of turmoil between the 13 colonies in North America and Britain, who was supposed to be the country that was in charge of these colonies. Now, the colonies weren't cooperating with what Britain wanted them to do, and the colonists felt like they weren't being treated fairly, so they didn't feel any urge to cooperate. However, they didn't want to go to full-scale war with Britain, so they came up with the First Continental Congress. They sent delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies to try to solve this problem. Georgia did not send a delegate because they were having problems on their frontier with Indians and were hoping that Britain would help them with that, and so they didn't want to get involved in the Continental Congress because they were afraid then Britain wouldn't help them, and they had their own issues with the Indians at their borders, Indians being the Native Americans. So, at the First Continental Congress, these 12 delegates had a goal, and their goal was to achieve a peaceful agreement with Britain. They did not want to go to full-scale war with Britain. They knew that Britain was very powerful. They would be outnumbered if they sent a bunch of people over there, and they just basically wanted to get along but not be treated unfairly. So, the Congress affirmed loyalty to Britain and agreed to let Parliament dictate foreign affairs in the colonies. So they said, okay, Britain, we're loyal to you. Parliament can say what goes on with the foreign affairs in the colonies. However, these colonists demanded that the Intolerable Acts be repealed. And the Intolerable Acts were a series of laws or taxes that were enforced, and some of them were taxes on goods that were just unbelievably high and weren't really warranted. Britain was just being greedy and wanting to make more money off of things than they needed to. And some of the other ones were just things that seemed unreasonable. They were forced to quarter British soldiers in their homes, whether they wanted to or not, and this just led to a lot of different things where they felt like their rights were being invaded, and they also didn't have representation back in Britain. There weren't an equal number of colonists over there in Parliament to represent them, so they felt like they shouldn't be paying as much in taxes. So there were a lot of different issues going on there, but the main thing that the colonists wanted was to have these different laws, known as the Intolerable Acts, repealed. And they instituted a trade embargo with Britain until this happened. So they said, okay, we're not trading with Britain anymore. We're not going to buy any more of their stuff. We're not going to ship them any more of our stuff until they repeal the Intolerable Acts. Otherwise, if they did that, we'd be happy to say we're loyal to Britain. Parliament can be in charge of foreign affairs over here in the colonies. That is not what happened. They did not reach their peaceful agreement. King George III of Britain declared the colonies must submit. They must do as Britain was saying, or face military action. So they've been threatened now. We aren't listening to all this, is what Britain is saying, King George is saying. We don't care that you want to be peaceful, you want this repealed. We're not doing any of that. You listen to us, or there's going to be military action. There will be consequences. So assemblies gathered weapons and formed militias, groups of citizen armies, basically. And these assemblies gathered in all of the colonies. Each colony had an assembly, and it was basically just a group that had collected weapons and sort of formed a militia. The British did not like the assemblies meeting. They didn't want them getting together and making any plans. So they were supposed to break up any assemblies that they wandered onto. And on April 19th, 1775, the British military was ordered to end a meeting of the Massachusetts Assembly. Now, the armed colonists that were in the assembly, because remember, they gathered weapons and had formed militias, The armed colonists resisted the British soldiers, and battles ensued on the Lexington Common. Now, these battles became known as the battles of Lexington and Concord, because that is where the battles between the British military and these armed colonists that were part of the Massachusetts Assembly occurred. And the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So the colonists tried to come to a peaceful solution. It didn't work out. King George said, "You're going to listen or there's going to be military action." When the colonists resisted and didn't listen, there was military action. Battles ensued, and the battles of Lexington and Concord became the first battles of the American Revolution. So, war has started. Now we come to the Second Continental Congress. Clearly, their solutions that they came up with up here did not work, so the delegates met again. This time, delegates from all 13 colonies came. Georgia was included. Georgia realized, Britain's not helping me with my Indian problem. I need to join with the rest of the colonies. So, delegates from all 13 colonies met in Philadelphia on May 10, 1775, less than a month after Lexington and Concord. So this is April 19th. On May 10th, less than a month after Lexington and Concord, they met. They realized, hey, the British mean business. They're clearly not going to come to a peaceful solution like we wanted. They're not going to repeal the Intolerable Acts. We have to form our own army. We've got to figure out what we're going to do because Britain is definitely going to fight back. So they focused on the defense of the American colonies and local government. Since Britain had been in charge of their government before, they had to come up with their own local government system. So part of what they did was work on local government. Part of what they did was talk about their defense. What were they going to do? So the delegates also discussed declaring independence from Britain. And this was a drastic thing because Britain was controlling all of them. But they said, you know what? We can declare ourselves independent from Britain. They're fighting us. They don't want to do what we want. It's hard to get across that whole big ocean to be over there and actually be represented in Parliament. Why not just have our own separate country over here? And many delegates were in favor of this option. So they established an army and named George Washington commander-in-chief. Now, at this point, they did not decide to declare independence. They discussed declaring independence from Britain. Many were in favor, but they hadn't declared it yet. They did establish an army and make George Washington commander-in-chief. They did discuss the defense of the American colonies, which resulted in this army, and they set up a provisional local government, an idea for how that was going to be run. However, by 1776, the delegates realized there was no turning back from full-scale war with Britain, and after this was over, there was no way they were going to patch things up. So they drafted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So your First Continental Congress was about trying to find a peaceful solution with Britain. The Second Continental Congress decided there can't be a peaceful solution. Britain's definitely going to fight us and is not going to give in. So they decided to form their own army. They chose a leader, and eventually they drafted the Declaration of Independence to declare themselves independent of Britain. The Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was proposed at the Second Continental Congress. By Richard Henry Lee, and was composed by a committee of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. So this was a document that was prepared by a group of people after the idea was suggested by Richard Henry Lee at the Second Continental Congress. The document has 3 parts: a preamble and reasons for separation. So this is kind of like an introduction. It lists out their grievances against England and their reasons for separating from England in the first place. A theory of government. The Americans lay out a theory for their new government separate from England. And a formal declaration of war. So after laying out all the reasons for separation, declaring themselves independent, coming up with their own theory of government, they formally declare war. Jefferson attempted to make it include a condemnation of slavery, but it was rebuffed. So even at this time, there were some people who thought slavery was wrong, but those people were still in the minority. So in order to pass the Declaration of Independence through the Second Continental Congress and be able to unite all of the 13 colonies, they left that part out because they knew that everyone wouldn't get behind it if it included that condemnation of slavery. The Declaration had many goals. There were many things that the people at the Second Continental Congress wanted to achieve with this Declaration of Independence. First of all, they wanted to enlist help from other British colonies. Right now, a lot of their ports were going to be blocked by British troops, British ships. And so if they could get help from other British colonies in the form of food, money, weapons, that would greatly help their cause. If they were unhappy with the way the British were treating them, their idea was that other British colonies were also unhappy with how they were being treated and might help the Americans. The Declaration was also there to help create a cause for which to fight. It gave all of the Americans something to unite behind and actually fight for. It wasn't just this tax or that tax, or we don't like the way England is doing things. Their cause was, we're going to be our own new country. We're fighting for our country, for our independence. And so people had an actual cause to fight, and it unified all of them. There were still some people who were reluctant, so this was there to help motivate reluctant colonists. There were some people who still felt very much a part of England. Maybe they hadn't come over as recently, or maybe they had just experienced good things in England, hadn't experienced as much bad, but a lot of them still had loyalty to England, and so it was hard for them to make that break and say, okay, we'll become a new country, we'll turn our back on England and know that we can never be a part of it again after we declare war on England and if we become a separate country like we would like to do. So this was there to motivate those reluctant colonists, to tell them, look, we've got a plan. Here are all the reasons we want to leave. Don't you agree with these? And most of the colonists probably would agree with them. It showed that they had a theory of government and that they were declaring war. So pretty much all of the colonists were united behind this. Another one of the Declaration's goals were to ensure that captured Americans would be treated as prisoners of war. Now, prisoners of war were going to be treated differently than, say, a citizen who you were punishing. That was your own citizen. So, if the English were still looking at the colonists as British citizens who were behaving as traitors, then they would get a much harsher punishment than they would if they were being looked at as prisoners of war. So this was ensuring that captured Americans would be treated as people from another country who were captured as prisoners of war, not as errant British citizens, because basically most of them would be put to death immediately as traitors if they were caught and they weren't recognized as prisoners of war. So this was there to help serve to protect any Americans that were captured by the British. And another one of the Declaration's goals was to establish an American theory of government. In fulfilling this last goal, Jefferson borrowed heavily from Enlightenment thinkers. Some of those included Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Locke, asserting famously that all men are created equal. So it was important for the Americans to have a theory of government. No country is going to run without a government. You have to have a way to build things, to communicate, to be able to basically get anything done, especially if you wanted your country to grow. And as a small country right now, the Americans did want to be strong, they did want to grow, and so they were looking to show people, look, we've got something to go on, we've got a plan. So they came up with this theory of government, and in writing this, Jefferson did lean heavily on the Enlightenment thinkers, asserting that all men are created equal. So he was still putting that out there, where he had tried to get in the condemnation of slavery. He couldn't get that past the Second Continental Congress members, but he was able to get this in. All men are created equal. And so that would be something that was used later to prove that slaves were equal to white men and to white people. So they weren't going to be thought of as less than a white person anymore eventually. At this time, people who were opposing slavery were still in the minority, but this shows that Jefferson was still trying to push that agenda forward. So the Declaration of Independence was written at the Second Continental Congress, and it had 3 parts to it. It listed out the reasons that the Americans were wanting to separate from Britain in the first place. It talked about their theory of government that they were coming up with, and it was a formal declaration of war. There are several goals that went along with the Declaration. They wanted to get help from other British colonies. They wanted to create a cause for which to fight. They wanted to motivate reluctant colonists. Anyone who hadn't been very much for the cause yet, they wanted to get them in there on their side. They wanted everybody fighting for this same cause, because they needed to be strong to be able to defeat England. They wanted to establish that any captured Americans would be treated as prisoners of war and not traitorous citizens of Britain. And they established that theory of government, which is very important because it showed people that they had a plan, there was going to be a new government in place, here's what it looked like, and it gave them a different option than what they'd been seeing from England. So, Declaration of Independence was formed and completely written at the Second Continental Congress.
Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were the first attempt of the newly independent colonies, now known as the United States of America, to establish the basics of independent government. So, the United States of America were independent now. They were free from Britain. They were recognized as an independent nation, but they had to find some way to rule themselves. They had to find some form of law. They had to write something down that said how they were going to govern themselves now that they were an independent nation. So the Articles of Confederation were their first attempt at this. The Continental Congress the same group that drafted the Declaration of Independence, now joined together again with delegates from all 13 states, and they passed the Articles of Confederation on November 15th, 1777. And they went into effect on March 1st, 1778. So it took a while because this was following ratification, basically approval, by all 13 states. So they waited for all 13 states to ratify the Articles of Confederation, approving them before they went into effect on March 1st the following year. The Articles prevented a strong central government, which meant that they prevented a central government from gaining too much power. The Americans were worried. They were scared. They had just gotten their independence from Britain, who had that strong central government who demanded so much from the individual citizens and the individual colonies. And so they were really worried about giving a central government too much power. So they wrote the Articles of Confederation, giving very little power to the central government. So a congressional body made up of delegates from all 13 states formed the central government. So every state got to send delegates. They met together. They would decide on things. However, individual states retained final authority. So, if this congressional body of all the delegates decided that everyone should pay so much in taxes to help pay for this new country they now have, the individual states could say, I don't think I want to do that to my citizens. They're still struggling because we just finished this war. They're still working on rebuilding their farms, rebuilding their homes, getting their crops back in order. I don't want to tax my people, so I'm not going to do it. And since the individual states had that authority, they didn't have to do what the central government said. So this didn't work out very well because every state was just doing what they wanted to do, and this was supposed to be the United States of America, where all the states formed a union and followed some of the same basic rules. So this weak alliance between the 13 states proved ineffective at settling disputes or enforcing laws. So if they tried to say, this is what happens as a result of this dispute, the states could just say, no, I don't think so, and do whatever they wanted. If they tried to enforce laws like taxation, even fair taxation, the states could say, oh no, I'm not going to make my citizens pay that. So eventually, recognition of these weaknesses led the Americans to draft a new document, the Constitution. So, the Articles of Confederation were the first attempt of the Americans to write something that described what kind of government they were going to have. It didn't work out very well because it gave power to the individual states, but very little power to a central government that could unite them all. So in the end, they had to write something new, the Constitution. Drafting the Constitution. After the Articles of Confederation weren't working out for the new nation of the United States of America, they decided to come up with something different. Delegates from 12 of the 13 states of America met from May 25th to September 17th, 1787 at what became known as the Constitutional Convention. The only state that did not send a delegate was Rhode Island, and that's because they didn't want to give up any of their state power, and they were worried that a new constitution would give more power to a central government, and they didn't want to lose their individual state power. They also had a lot of their own paper money printed, and part of the goal of the Constitutional Convention was to produce a national currency that all of the states would use, and Rhode Island didn't want to give up their currency, so they didn't attend the Constitutional Convention. In the end, they did sign the Constitution and become a state in the United States of America under the current Constitution when they realized they were surrounded by so many other states, and it wasn't really going to work out for them to remain their own nation separate from the United States of America. But at the convention, they did not have a delegate present. The delegates' original purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation. They realized it wasn't working, and they said, okay, we need to revise this. However, it was quickly realized that a revision would not be enough to provide a workable government structure. The Articles of Confederation made central government too weak and gave the states too much power. So instead of being able to simply revise the Articles of Confederation, something new was going to have to be written. After vowing to keep all proceedings secret, delegates set out to draft a new document that eventually became the Constitution of the United States of America. By keeping it secret until completed, the delegates were able to present a full, completed draft to the country, to their home states, for ratification instead of haggling over details. So they could bring home this completed document and say, okay, it's time to approve this home state, and each state could ratify it. Instead of having to haggle over every detail, the members of the Constitutional Convention, those delegates, worked out all the details, and even with them, there were a lot of people there, so it took a lot of haggling to get it worked out. But instead of going and bringing everything back to your home state for a vote, they all decided right there in the convention on all the details, and then brought this completed document home and said, okay, now it's time for our state to ratify this. So each state had its own convention, and eventually all of them ratified the Constitution. The first part of the Constitution focused on separation of powers. And this was important to the Americans because they did not want the central government to have too much power, since they had just gotten out from underneath the British Empire's rule, where it was very harsh. They had received a lot of unfair taxation and a lot of unfair laws that they thought took away their natural rights. And so they wanted to be sure that wasn't going to happen again in their new government by giving too much power to a central government. So they included 3 branches of the central government, which include the legislative, which consisted of a bicameral Congress, which today we know as the House of Representatives, and the Senate. There are 2 different houses for Congress. The executive, which is the president, and the judiciary branch, which is the Supreme Court and other federal courts. So you've got your legislative, your executive, and your judiciary branches. And the delegates included checks and balances to keep any one branch of the central government from gaining too much power. So in that way, they were able to appease all the delegates and make sure that they weren't going to give too much power to one branch of the central government and would not, in effect, give too much power to the central government as a whole. And the states could still retain some of their individual rights. And that is how our Constitution was drafted.
A fundamental belief held by founding fathers was that our basic individual liberties originated from God or came from God. This is one reason the Bill of Rights is part of our U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights is composed of the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Now, the Bill of Rights was part of a compromise between the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. The Federalist approved of ratifying the U.S. Constitution, while the Anti-Federalists were opposed. One reason the Anti-Federalists opposed ratifying or approving the U.S. Constitution among the states was because the U.S. Constitution, as drafted out of the 1787 Convention in Philadelphia, did not have a listing of rights as the state constitutions had and still have today. The Anti-Federalists stated, how can you have a constitution which bounds or restricts government, but not have rights listed that government should guarantee or protect? So what the Federalists promised or compromised is that if some Anti-Federalists would agree to ratify the U.S. Constitution, one of the first acts of Congress would be to ratify a listing of rights or the Bill of Rights to the U.S. Constitution. The Bill of Rights were ratified in December 15th, 1791. Now let's look at these amendments, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The First Amendment lists 5 basic freedoms: the freedom of religion, speech, press, peaceable assembly, and government petition. With the freedom of religion, it's the idea that the people would be able to worship as their heart and as they see fit, and there would not be any government-sponsored church. Freedom of speech and press gives individuals the right to express their beliefs and feelings about government, even if those beliefs are contrary or against the government. And the reason we're able to have a free press, that is, newspapers today, televisions, radio, is because of the First Amendment protects the right of the people to express their beliefs. Then you have freedom of peaceable assembly, the idea that the people collectively can come together and protest their government, and government petition. Petition meaning to ask or demand from their government. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, or the right of the people to own firearms for their individual protection and, if need be, to prevent government tyranny. We would say the first 5 freedoms listed in the Bill of Rights mean nothing without the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment provides a protection of the people from the quartering of soldiers in private homes except by law during wartime. Before the American Revolution, during the French and Indian War, the American colonists were forced by the British government, and even after the French and Indian War, they were forced into quartering or housing soldiers in their private homes without a law. It was just a military edict. The Third Amendment protects the people from that type of abuse. Then you have the Fourth Amendment, which is a protection from unreasonable search and seizure. The idea that people can find peace and privacy in their person and among their papers and in their homes. The Fifth Amendment provides for due process and protection from double jeopardy and self-incrimination. Due process, that if someone is charged with a crime, there is a process, a rule of law, in order to find that person either guilty or innocent. Protection against double jeopardy. You cannot be found guilty for the same crime multiple times. And self-incrimination. The government cannot force you to take the testimony stand and testify against yourself. The Sixth Amendment, the right of the accused to a speedy public trial before an impartial jury. The idea is that if you're accused of a crime, the trial will be speedy, quick as possible, and it will be a public trial. You will not be allowed to languish in jail. And the trial will be public, where people can see that, again, going back to Amendment 5, that due process is being adhered to. And then the case is laid out before an impartial jury, a jury that is just going to look at the merits of the case and decide either guilty or not guilty. The Seventh Amendment protects the right of the people to a civil trial by jury in accordance with common law. Now, civil law or a civil trial is different from a criminal trial. In a civil trial, we're dealing with disagreements between individuals or different groups of people. A criminal trial is a crime, a harm. It's a trial that attempts to right a crime or a harm done against someone else, such as murder, theft, or burglary. A civil trial is a disagreement, maybe a business disagreement, between two individuals concerning a contract. Well, the Seventh Amendment protects the right of the people that if you seek redress in a civil court, you have a right to a trial. And that trial by jury is conducted in accordance with common law. Then we have the Eighth Amendment. The idea is that the people are protected from cruel and unusual punishment and excessive fines and bail. This is pretty self-explanatory. The Eighth Amendment protects the people from the government imposing very cruel and unreasonable punishments on the people. The punishment should fit the crime. Amendment 9 preserves rights not mentioned. In other words, any right not mentioned in the Bill of Rights is automatically preserved and reserved to individuals. And then the 10th Amendment is a preservation of the rights of states and individuals. The idea that any powers that are not given to the national government in the Constitution, or any rights not given to the national government in the Constitution, are automatically reserved to the states and the individuals respectively.
Marbury versus Madison. William Marbury was one of the Federalist judges removed from office by the Judiciary Act of 1802. After Thomas Jefferson became president after the election of 1800, he pushed through the Judiciary Act of 1802. Now, the Judiciary Act of 1801 had been passed with the intention of keeping Federalist judges in place after the election, but Thomas Jefferson passed an act a year later that removed 42 of those Federalist judges. So William Marbury was one of those Federalist judges that had been removed from his office. Marbury, having been promised a job, brought up the issue with James Madison, who was then Secretary of State, but James Madison pleaded ignorance. He said, "I don't know anything about this promise you received. I'm not going to honor it." Now the issue became contentious, and in 1803 came before the Supreme Court as Marbury versus Madison. Although Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 had a writ of mandamus which required Madison to honor the appointment, Chief Justice John Marshall declared this section unconstitutional. So he declared Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional because he said that that was beyond the scope of the Constitution. It was inconsistent with what the Constitution actually gave Congress the power to do. And so the Supreme Court under John Marshall said that actually they didn't have to honor giving Marbury that job because what he was claiming he should get the job under was actually an unconstitutional part of the act. This was a historic act. Before now, the Supreme Court had not declared measures unconstitutional on a national level before. So, this was something that Congress had enacted. It wasn't something that was a state law or state situation that they had said, oh, that's unconstitutional, we're not going to have any of that. This is on a national level where the judicial branch was checking the legislative branch. So it was a very important event in the scope of the United States history because it was giving the judicial branch more power, or at least establishing that the judicial branch had that power. Since the three branches of government are supposed to have checks and balances on each other to make sure no one branch becomes too powerful, it was very important that the judicial branch was showing they had this power. Marshall established an independent judiciary with this case. He is quoted as saying, "The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, with the Supreme Court as the final interpreter." And that is pretty much how it goes. The Supreme Court gets to interpret the Constitution. If there's a part in there that's up for debate, then the Supreme Court can interpret it whichever way they think is most fair or most what the writers of the Constitution had in mind. So Marbury versus Madison was a very important case because it did establish that the judicial branch, in the form of the Supreme Court, could declare an act of Congress unconstitutional. So the judicial branch had that important check on the legislative branch. So this is very important in the scope of United States history. Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who had been taken by his owner from Missouri, a slave state, and after they left Missouri, Dred Scott and his owner, he then traveled to Illinois, a free state, and then to the Minnesota Territory, considered free land based on the Missouri Compromise. Then he returned to Missouri. So Scott was actually with his family, which was his wife and 2 daughters, and they were traveling with his owner, who was a doctor in the United States Army. So the Army sent him to different places. He was in Missouri, then he got stationed in Illinois, then he was sent out to the Minnesota Territory, which meant that Scott and his family were taken into free states and into a free territory. And so some people thought he should be considered free now because he had been in free lands, which would have given him his freedom. Other people said no, he was still property of his owner, the doctor. And so there was some confusion on this, and there were lots of people on both sides of the debate. And this idea became more and more popular and more of an issue. So after his owner died, after they returned to Missouri, Scott and abolitionists who wanted to abolish slavery or get rid of it took his case to court, stating that Scott and his family were free after living in free territory. Now the case got passed up and up and up, and eventually it made it to the Supreme Court, which seriously tested the United States laws regarding slavery. So in the Missouri Compromise, Congress had come up with some certain laws that would be a compromise for both the slave states and the free states. And those laws, along with the other constitutional laws, all came into question with the Supreme Court when they had to decide this case. Was Dred Scott and were his family members free because they had traveled into free territory, or were they still considered slaves because they were still property of that owner? Well, the Supreme Court decided that as a slave, Scott was not a U.S. citizen. Therefore, he could not sue for freedom. So, since he wasn't a citizen, he couldn't sue for freedom. His time in free states did not change his status. So, the Supreme Court ruled that no, he and his family were not free. They were still considered slaves. They were passed to the doctor's wife, and whenever she remarried, they got passed off back to Dred Scott's first owner. And so he didn't get his freedom with this Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court said, no, you're not free. Even though you went in the free states, you were still property of that doctor, and the doctor shouldn't be deprived of his personal property because of where he travels. So that was how the Supreme Court was thinking. And since he wasn't a citizen himself, because he was of African descent, he couldn't sue for his own freedom. And finally, the Supreme Court decided that the Missouri Compromise was overturned as unconstitutional. So first and foremost, all laws and decisions need to be constitutional. They need to be in line with what the Constitution says. And the Supreme Court said, actually, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. We're overturning it. The court said Congress had overstepped its bounds by outlawing slavery in the territories. This gave popular sovereignty to all states and territories, which meant that each state or territory got to decide for itself whether it was going to be a slave state or a free state or territory. And so the Missouri Compromise, trying to dictate which states would be free and which would be slave states or territories, the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional. Each state should get to decide for itself. We're going to make sure popular sovereignty is very clear, and that's what we're going to go by. We're not going to go by the Missouri Compromise. And they also said Dred Scott and his family should still be slaves, and they should just be passed off like property as since his owner had died. And so this decision spurred public outrage, especially among the abolitionists who wanted Dred Scott to become free and were trying to abolish slavery. And it deepened tensions between the northern and southern states. So the northern states were primarily abolitionists, primarily free states. The southern states are primarily slave states. And so tensions between those two areas of one country grew even deeper because this case had made it clear that the North felt one way very decisively, and the South was still leaning towards slavery very heavily. And eventually it was going to be a bigger problem. Now, there is a happy ending for Dred Scott because while the Supreme Court did not decide that he was supposed to be free and that his family should be free, Dred Scott and his family got passed off to his owner who died's wife. The wife remarried. Her husband gave Dred Scott and his family back to his original owners, and that owner immediately set him free and emancipated him. So 3 months after this court decision, Dred Scott and his wife and 2 daughters did become free African American people. They still didn't count as citizens yet because anyone of African descent couldn't count as a citizen at this point in time. But they did become free people and could go live in the free states and make their own money and didn't belong to anyone. They weren't owned by anyone. So there was a happy ending for Dred Scott, but this case spurred more and more tension between the northern and southern states.
Up here on the board are 12 landmark Supreme Court cases. So Baker versus Carr established the principle of one person, one vote. What that means is that legislative districts must contain the same amount of people, because if they do not, then some people will be more represented than others. And then it also ruled that redistricting cases can be heard by federal courts, because since redistricting is a state issue, the idea here was that, well, these kind of cases can't be heard by federal courts, but Baker versus Carr ruled that they can be. And then there's Brown versus Board of Education, sometimes known as Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. And it ruled that separate educational facilities are unequal. So the case made it illegal for racial segregation to exist within public education facilities. Before, the idea was that the races could be segregated as long as the facilities are equal. But this case found that the supposedly equal public facilities were not actually equal. And then there's Gideon versus Wainwright, which established the right to free legal counsel. And then there's Korematsu versus the U.S., which allowed the government to place Japanese Americans in internment camps during World War II. Mapp versus Ohio was a case regarding that evidence gathered in violation of the Fourth Amendment can't be used. So what's the Fourth Amendment? Well, the Fourth Amendment outlines how evidence can be found. It deals with search warrants. So say, for example, that a police officer entered a home without a search warrant, but they found incriminating evidence. Well, that evidence cannot be used in a court of law because the evidence was gathered in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And then there's Marbury versus Madison, which established judicial review. This is an extremely important court case. It took place in 1803, and it really set a precedent for all of the Supreme Court cases that have followed. And so the Supreme Court decided that it had the power to invalidate a statute which it found to be in violation of the Constitution. So this is a check and a balance system, because if Congress passes a law and then the president signs it, that law can't just go into effect even if it violates the Constitution. The Supreme Court is there as a check on the power of the other two branches. And so they can strike down a statute if they find it in conflict with the Constitution. And then there's McCulloch versus Maryland, which established the authority of national law over state law. So specifically, McCulloch versus Maryland concerned whether the national government had the legal power to establish a national bank. And so the state of Maryland was opposed to the national bank. So in an effort to drive it out, it taxed the Maryland branch of the bank. So this case found that the national government did have the legal power to have such a bank. But that's not what made this case famous. What made it famous is that, in addition, the court established that the national government, as long as it is abiding by the Constitution, is supreme over state law. So if national law and state law are in conflict with each other, state law has to budge. And then there's Miranda versus Arizona. This court, in this case, the court ruled that the Fifth Amendment requires the arrested to be told legal rights. So this is known as the Miranda rights. Whenever law enforcement arrests someone, they have to inform them of their rights. A couple of these rights that are well known are the right to remain silent and the right to legal counsel. And then Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that established the legality of separate but equal. Now that sounds slightly familiar because we just talked about that with Brown versus Board of Education. So all these court cases are up here in alphabetical order, not chronological. So Plessy versus Ferguson actually came before Brown versus Board of Education. And so Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. But at this time, this court decided that separate but equal facilities were okay, and so that was the law of the land at the time. And then there's Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. And this banned quota systems in the college admissions process. But it ruled that programs providing advantages to minorities are constitutionally sound. Because what was happening here is that in an effort to increase minority enrollment, they had these quota systems in place to help minorities. But the court ruled that the quota systems were hurting the majority. So while it banned the quota systems, it still allowed the other programs providing advantages to minorities. And then Roe versus Wade overturned most state laws prohibiting abortion. Then Scott versus Sanford was later overturned, and it said that African Americans could never be granted U.S. citizenship. So like I said, this was overturned by the 14th Amendment, but at the time this was the law of the land. And so this applied to all African Americans, whether enslaved or free. Now, this case is a lot of times more well known as Dred Scott versus Sanford, or known as the Dred Scott case, because Dred Scott was trying to become a U.S. citizen. But because the court decided that African Americans could never be granted U.S. citizenship, then the court also ruled that Dred Scott didn't even have a right to bring this case to court, because only U.S. citizens have that right. So in their ruling, they really invalidated Dred Scott's whole case because they said that he could never even be a U.S. citizen. So that's a look at some landmark Supreme Court cases.
French and Indian War. There are many events that led up to the French and Indian War. The Spanish Armada, which was their fleet of ships, was defeated by England in 1588. This led to a decline in Spanish power in Europe. So you had Spain, France, and England, who all were very powerful in Europe. After the Spanish Armada was defeated by England, the Spanish power started to decline. So then France and England
became the most powerful nations in Europe. This led them to fight several wars between 1689 and 1748. This is especially important because there were powerful nations in Europe that were colonizing. So they were both big into colonizing in North America, and Spain had been as well. But after it was conquered, they kind of lost all their colonial territories as well. So the wars that France and England fought were King William's War, or the 9 Years' War, which was fought between 1689 and 1697. Next, you had the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War, from 1702 to 1713. Then you had the War of Austrian Succession, or King George's War, from 1740 to 1748. Now, these were all about France and England trying to claim territory in North America that had previously belonged to Spain. The fourth and final war was the French and Indian War, which was fought from 1754 to 1763. And this was fought primarily in North America, since that was the area they were fighting for. They were fighting for the colonial territory in North America that had previously been held by Spain. This war was also called the 7 Years' War. Now, I know if you do the math, it adds up to 9 years over here. But the most of the fighting happened from 1756 to 1763, which was where they get the 7 years from. And at times, all 4 of these wars are considered the French and Indian Wars. And the reason they're called that is because the French and the Indians were 2 of the main groups that England was fighting against. So they called it the French and Indian War because they're fighting the French and the Indians, the Native Americans that lived in North America. However, England also had Native Americans that fought on their side. So it wasn't a very aptly named war because they were fighting Indians, but they also had Indians, Native Americans, on their side fighting against the French. The Indians kind of split, and some sided with the French and some sided with the English. So it didn't really make the most sense, but that is still what it's called. It is still referred to as the 7 Years' War by other people who didn't like the name French and Indian War and thought that 7 Years' War was more appropriate since the Indians weren't solely an enemy to the English. They also helped them depending on which tribes we were talking about. Now, the French and Indian War, the final war in this series of 4 wars, resulted in the end of France's reign as a colonial power. So that is why it is so important. Because after this 7-year war, France was defeated and England was able to claim all of the colonies in North America as English colonies or British colonies. So France was kicked out as a colonial power. Still important in Europe, but not as important as it was because it doesn't have the colonial power that it had. It doesn't have those colonies in North America anymore. Now they are all going to be called British colonies. And the cost incurred during this war led to discontent among the colonists, which helped spark the American Revolution. So colonists helped fight. If they were colonists of the French, they helped. If they were colonists of the English, they helped the English. And so these colonists were having to help, but they were also having to help feed British and French troops. They were having to help supply all of their time. So instead of being able to work on making goods or planting crops, they were having to help fight. They were having to give up their weapons, their ammunition. Anything they had was basically going to this war effort. And so at the end of it, they had incurred a lot of costs, and they were very unhappy about this. And as Britain continued to, or England continued to tax them and charge them for things after they just spent all this money on a war, this helped spark the American Revolution. The Revolutionary War. The British military plan during the early stages of the Revolutionary War was known as the Saratoga Campaign. it laid out a three-pronged plan to capture New York and separate the Northeast from the Southern colonies. So when we say a three-pronged plan, I mean that there were three generals that were supposed to carry out different parts of this plan to capture New York. Once New York was captured, that would effectively separate the Northeast colonies from the Southern colonies. They couldn't share information with each other, they couldn't share supplies with each other, and that would weaken the colonial war effort. This plan broke down because one of the generals, this was General Howe, was supposed to go up the Hudson River to Albany. But he decided to go after Philadelphia instead. So General Howe didn't follow orders. He went after a different city that would have been a good city to capture, but when he didn't follow this plan, it kind of made problems for it, and New York wasn't able to be captured. So the first general didn't follow orders, went after the wrong city. Another general, Burgoyne, was able to capture Fort Ticonderoga, but then languished without supplies for months, and he eventually had to surrender to colonial troops. So General Burgoyne followed orders. He was moving toward New York. He captured Fort Ticonderoga, and then they stayed there because they didn't have a lot of supplies to move forward, and he languished without supplies for months. No one brought in any supplies. He wasn't able to send people out for supplies to keep moving forward, so eventually he had to surrender to colonial troops. The third general, St. Leger, made considerable progress across New York from Lake Ontario. So he started at Lake Ontario and started making his way across New York. But his troops lost steam after a series of small battles. So they were making good progress, but as they got further into New York, after a few small battles, this group lost steam and also didn't make it to New York. So the colonial General Gates defeated the British General Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. And this defeat confirmed the failure of the Saratoga campaign. So, in the early stages of the Revolutionary War, the British had the Saratoga campaign. They were going to try to separate the Northeast colonies from the Southern colonies by capturing New York. This failed because one general didn't follow orders and two generals just weren't able to keep going forward and make it there. With the defeat of General Burgoyne by the colonial General Gates, this effectively confirmed the failure of the British Saratoga campaign. More importantly, it convinced the French that the Americans could win the war. The French then signed the Treaty of Alliance in 1778, which supplied the Americans with men, money, and ships. So the colonists had been trying to gain support from other colonies and from other nations. They had been trying to gain their independence from Britain. They wanted to win this war, and they'd been trying to enlist people's help. Well, no one was going to help the person they thought would, or the group that they thought would definitely win the war. But whenever the colonists were able to keep the British from carrying out their Saratoga campaign, whenever they defeated General Burgoyne, it showed them, or at least it showed the French, that the Americans actually could win this war. Remember, no colony had ever rebelled against its colonizing nation, the home nation, without being pushed back down. there was never a colony before this time that broke away from the home nation, the nation that had colonized it in the first place. So this was going to be a first-time thing, and people weren't sure it was going to actually happen. But the French became convinced after this battle and this defeat of the British that the Americans might win. So they signed the Treaty of Alliance, and they agreed to help. That gave the Americans more men, more money, and more ships. The French hoped to gain back the territory they had lost in the French and Indian War. So the French weren't doing this just to be nice, just to help out, because now they thought they might win. They were doing this because they saw some benefit in it for themselves. They had lost land during the French and Indian War. They hoped to gain back that territory. If they helped the Americans, maybe the Americans would let them have that land back. They also believed that by aiding the Americans, they could position themselves to colonize parts of North America as yet unclaimed. So at this point, there was still a lot of North America that wasn't claimed by anyone. No one was colonizing it. So the French were hoping that if they helped the Americans would give them access to colonize some of this uncolonized land. So this was an important defeat because it showed the French that the Americans could win, and the French helped them. The French joined the American forces to defeat the British. With their military failure in the North, the British decided to switch strategies and attempt to retake the southern colonies. So they had tried in the North to separate the Northeast and southern colonies by taking New York. That had failed, and so now they said, okay, we'll try to do the South first. If we can reconquer the South and take control there, we can work our way up. So the British military campaign in the southern colonies was planned by Sir Henry Clinton and implemented by General Cornwallis in the years 1778 to 1781. Cornwallis quickly took Savannah and Charleston and then moved into the interior of South Carolina. So he started on the coast, and then he started working his way in. Here and in North Carolina, so in South Carolina and North Carolina, a series of bloody battles weakened Cornwallis. So while Cornwallis was moving forward, it wasn't easy progress. There were bloody battles being fought, and with every one of those, Cornwallis's troops were weakened. So after being weakened by several of these battles, Cornwallis was forced to make a supply run to Yorktown on the Virginia coast. Now, when he made this supply run, the British suffered a naval defeat at the hands of the French. And then were forced to retreat by Washington-led troops. So the French had a powerful navy, the British had a powerful navy. The Americans didn't yet have a powerful navy. So when they gained the French's allies, they gained ships. They gained access to fight on the water, to be able to actually be a fair opponent for the British. So whenever Cornwallis went down the coast to Virginia for his supply run at Yorktown, the French defeated them on the water, and then once they went back inland, the British were forced to retreat by Washington-led troops. So you have the Americans fighting them on the land, and the French fighting them on the water, and Cornwallis wasn't in a very good place at this point. During their retreat, the British naval forces were further weakened by a violent storm. So any chance they had of surviving at sea and being able to fight well was going to be hindered by this storm. So they had more losses due to this storm, and Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 17th, 1781. So he started trying to make his way in the south. He conquered a couple of cities, started moving inland, had a lot of bloody battles, and needed to restock. Whenever he went to get more supplies, he was defeated by the French and then was being forced to retreat by Washington-led troops, so by the American colonists. And then, after a violent storm, Cornwallis's troops were further weakened, and he really knew he wasn't going to win this thing, so he was forced to surrender on October 17th, 1781. Cornwallis's surrender effectively ended the Revolutionary War in the colonists' favor. So getting the British general to surrender effectively ended the war and meant that the American colonists had won. So the British military started off in the north. They wanted to capture New York and separate the northeast from the south, and by keeping the colonies separated, cut off them being able to exchange information, exchange troops, and exchange food and other supplies. This plan failed, and the failure of this plan led the French to say, okay, we think America can win, and the French joined forces with the Americans. This was a big help to the Americans, and it meant that the British were going to have a harder opponent to fight. Then the British decided to try to fight in the South. General Cornwallis started along the North and South Carolina coast and started working his way inland. He was forced to retreat and get more supplies at Yorktown, Virginia. There he was defeated on the water by the French, and then he was forced to retreat by the American colonists. After a violent storm, he had lost even more troops and was forced to surrender. And on October 17, 1781, the Revolutionary War was effectively ended, meaning the Americans had defeated the British. The Mexican-American War. The immediate causes of the Mexican-American War were the American annexation of Texas, disputes over the southern border of Texas, the large amount of money owed to the United States by Mexico, and the Mexicans held the U.S. in contempt, considering them greedy land grabbers. So, there were many causes for the Mexican-American War. Things had kind of been leading up to this for a while. The Americans annexed Texas. The United States made Texas a state, made it part of the country. Texas had previously belonged to Mexico, and then Texas had declared its independence and had been an independent country for 9 years at the time that it was annexed. But Mexico still felt like if Texas wasn't going to be independent, it should belong to Mexico. And part of Texas they still felt like belonged to them because there were still disputes over the southern border of Texas, so the border between Texas and Mexico. The United States also was unhappy about the large amount of money that Mexico owed them. So Mexico owed them all this money, but was still saying, no, that's our land, no, you can't have it, even though Texas was supposed to already have some of the land in question. The Mexicans also held the United States in contempt, considering them greedy land grabbers. Now, in fairness, the United States did have their idea of manifest destiny that they were trying to accomplish, making the United States stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, from east to west. And the United States had been steadily expanding since its formation. So the United States was taking up a lot of land, but they did at least try to pay for it or make some kind of amends whenever they did get land. But Mexico wasn't open to the idea at all. So Polk sent an emissary to buy Texas, California, and some Mexican territory around that area for $30 million. And he was refused. So $30 million was a pretty good chunk of money at this time. Mexico actually owed the United States money, but Polk sent an emissary saying, we'll pay you $30 million for Texas, which they'd already annexed and felt like they owned, for California, which was newer territory that the United States wanted, and some more Mexican territory that was near these areas. So he did try to buy it. So while the Americans may have been greedy land grabbers, they did at least try to pay for land whenever they were trying to take over it. So they did try to pay for it here. Now, he was refused. Mexico said, no way, Jose, we're not selling any of that land. Zachary Taylor then led an American expedition into a disputed area of Texas. So this was an area that the United States felt like it was entitled to. After they had annexed Texas, this would be a part of the United States, so they were in an area they felt like was their land. Now, it was a disputed area, so Mexico felt like this area was their land as well. Some of Taylor's men were killed. So in this expedition, in this disputed area, there were also Mexican citizens, and some of Taylor's men were killed in this area. Polk was able to use these deaths as a rationale for war, despite considerable opposition in Congress. So Congress didn't necessarily want to go to war, but Polk felt like war was the quickest option to get these goals accomplished since his offer of buying the territory had been refused. Overall, the Democrats supported the war, while the Whigs, led in part by Abraham Lincoln, were opposed to the war. So he did have some support in Congress, but there was considerable opposition in Congress, and with the deaths of some of Taylor's men in this disputed area, which the United States did consider to be its land, Polk was able to rationalize the necessity of war at this time. So they went to war, and the United States emerged victorious from the Mexican-American War. This was not an especially long war. It was actually pretty quick. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848 after Polk sent an emissary with cash. So this time he didn't just say, oh, we'll pay you this much. He sent cash and said, here's this money. We would like to persuade Santa Anna, the leader of Mexico at this time, to stop the war. So Polk sent an emissary, and he actually sent cash money with this emissary to persuade Santa Anna to stop the war. And that was enough with the defeats that the Mexicans had been suffering to cause Santa Anna to say, okay, I'll sign the treaty. So under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the United States got California. This was new area. The rest of Texas, so any part of Texas that had been disputed, and all of the Mexican territory between Louisiana and California, including present-day Utah and Nevada. In exchange, the United States erased a good deal of Mexico's debts. So, in the beginning, Polk said, we'll pay you $30 million for Texas, California, and some of your Mexican territory. They refused. In the end, Mexico suffered some crushing defeats during the Mexican-American War, and then eventually gave the United States the rest of Texas, California, and all of the Mexican territory between Louisiana and California. And they didn't actually get any money given to them at this time. The United States just erased a good deal of Mexico's debt, which wasn't really that much of a burden to the United States. The United States didn't have this money to begin with because Mexico hadn't paid it back to them. So they just said, okay, you won't owe us this anymore. They'd already spent the money as far as they were concerned because it had been out of the budget. So it wasn't as big of a loss for the United States to erase these debts as it would have been for them to pay the $30 million to Mexico in the first place. So the United States really made out like bandits here, and Mexico didn't really get that great of a deal. But the Mexican-American War was ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States gained a lot more territory, and Mexico got some of its debts erased. Controversy immediately erupted over whether the new territories would be allowed to have slaves. Some abolitionists wanted to cancel the treaty altogether, while some Southern Democrats wanted to claim the entirety of Mexico. So, the abolitionists wanted to get rid of slaves. They wanted to free all the slaves and get rid of the institution of slavery altogether. A lot of the states that practiced slavery were in the South. A lot of the free states were in the North. So as more Southern territory was acquired, the slave states thought, ooh, these will be more slave states. If you have more votes in Congress through your states that are all voting for different bills or laws that will help the institution of slavery, then you're going to have a better chance of winning and getting those bills passed. So the states really didn't want there to be an imbalance that wasn't in their favor. So if all of these territories were allowed to have slaves, then that would create several new states that were slave states, and that would outnumber the free states. If they were not allowed slaves, then that would make several new free states, which would greatly outnumber the slave states. So the abolitionists wanted to cancel the treaty altogether. They said, oh, no, if we're getting all this territory and slaves are going to be allowed, we don't even want this territory. We want to cancel the treaty altogether. While some of the Southern Democrats wanted to claim all of Mexico. Hey, we're getting all this land from Mexico right now. They really lost in the war. They were crushed at several different battles. Let's just take all of Mexico, because the more land we have in the South, the more land we're going to have that will most likely be slave states. So the South saw this as an opportunity for more slave states and wanted to keep pushing. The North saw this as a possibility of more slave states and said, oh, let's just back away completely. Well, they didn't go out of the treaty, and they didn't go try to take all of Mexico. So while different people had these very extreme opinions, neither of those things actually happened. But there was a lot of controversy over this new territory, and it was a hot-button issue because people didn't want there to be too many slave states or too many free states. They liked there being a balance so that in Congress there wasn't too much of an imbalance when it came to voting for different bills or laws to be passed. So the Mexican-American War was caused as a result of the annexation of Texas by the United States, disputes over the southern boundary between Texas, which was now the United States, and Mexico, the fact that Mexico owed a large amount of money to the United States, and the perception that the United States was greedy and they were land grabbers that the Mexicans held. Polk tried to buy the territory that the United States wanted and was refused when he sent an expedition into a disputed area of Texas, and some United States soldiers were killed, or United States men on this expedition were killed. Polk was able to use this as a rationale for the Mexican-American War. This war was not very long, and the United States ended up emerging victorious, and with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, they came out much ahead in this war. They reestablished boundaries. The United States gained California, the rest of Texas, and all the area between Louisiana and California. So this was a big territory gain for the United States. And the United States simply erased some of Mexico's debt instead of actually having to pay Mexico for this exchange. There was a lot of controversy after this, after the Mexican-American War, over if the territory would become slave territory or free territory. Triangular trade. Triangular trade is a historical term indicating trade between three ports or regions. Three sides of a triangle, so trade between three ports or regions. Now, triangular trade is a term that is often mentioned whenever discussing the economy of the North American colonies. So, once England, France, Spain started posting colonies in North America, and then the Spanish Armada was defeated, and France and England fought over them, and then England became the sole proprietor of the colonies of North America. At that point, there were several colonies that were well established and were ready to trade and had been trading for some time, and a triangular trade route developed. So from North America, from the colonies, they would send rum, and they would send rum to Africa. In Africa, that rum was traded for gold or slaves, and then the gold and slaves were taken to the West Indies. Slaves were traded for sugar, molasses, or money in the West Indies. And then those Same traders traveled back to the North American colonies with sugar and molasses, which the colonists made into more rum. And it was a triangular cycle that continued for several years. Now, sometimes slaves did make their way to North America. By 1619, slaves had started to arrive into the colonies to help farm the different plantations that were growing there. But a primary export from the West Indies in this triangular trade route was the sugar and molasses, which made more rum, which could be traded to Africa. And so this triangular trade route went on for a good long while. Now, this trade triangle violated the Molasses Act of 1733, which required the colonists to pay high duties or taxes to England for molasses acquired from other countries. So if they had any molasses or sugar coming in, the colonists were supposed to pay a tax on that to England over here. But the colonists, they ignored these duties. They said, England's way over there. They have no part in this, so we're not going to pay them taxes or duties on this sugar and molasses coming in. Why should we pay them for this molasses? They had no part in getting it here. So they had to pay for it or trade rum for more molasses, but they didn't have to pay England, even though there was a law, the Molasses Act of 1733, telling them they had to. There was no one there really to enforce it. The British government did not enforce these duties. No one enforced them. So it was like people were saying, you have to do this, but no one was there to enforce it. And this was known as a policy of salutary neglect. And basically, England kept coming up with more and more rules and telling the colonists, you have to follow these rules, you have to follow these rules. We've declared you pay taxes on this and that. And the colonists just kept saying, yeah, okay, that's great. I'm not going to do any of that because you're not here to enforce it. Until eventually with the American Revolution, Britain started trying to enforce some of these rules and taxes. But after this system of salutary neglect, the colonists were used to not having to pay these taxes and just hearing about them, and they didn't like it being enforced, which is what spurred on the American Revolution. Back to triangular trade. It's when you have 3 different ports or regions that are exchanging goods in a triangular fashion. You see, the rum is not going straight to the West Indies. Rum is only going to Africa. Slaves are going here to the West Indies. And then the sugar and molasses is coming to North America. So each region has a different thing to offer that's going to the next place. And so by trading at each port something that is trading for something else that is needed, all 3 ports have their needs met. And so that is the point of triangular trade, is for each port or region to give something into that trade route that the other 2 can't provide. And so by doing that, all 3 ports or regions have their needs met. The Louisiana Purchase. In an agreement between the French and Spanish, known alternately as the Treaty of Ile-de-France or the Retrocession, Napoleon Bonaparte acquired Louisiana. This, along with Spain's closing of New Orleans to American business, made Jefferson nervous. So he sent James Monroe to France in order to purchase New Orleans and West Florida. So, Thomas Jefferson was the president at this time, and whenever Napoleon acquired Louisiana and Spain had closed New Orleans, which was a major port city in that area, to American business, Jefferson got nervous, and he sent James Monroe to France to purchase New Orleans and West Florida from Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte, himself made anxious by a rebellion in Haiti and a renewal of hostilities with the British, signed over 800,000 square miles to the United States, making the Louisiana Purchase the largest land acquisition without bloodshed in human history. Napoleon hoped to curry favor with the United States in order to forestall a possible Anglo-American alliance. So Jefferson was nervous about Spain and France getting along, France acquiring this large amount of land where American business was already being blocked in New Orleans. So Jefferson sent someone to go and try to purchase this area. Napoleon was already nervous because he had a rebellion going in Haiti, and he had hostilities stirring up again with the British. So he signed over 800,000 square miles to the United States, and this was the largest land acquisition in human history without bloodshed. There was no fighting to gain this land. It was all signed over on paper. And Napoleon did this because he hoped to curry favor with the United States and forestall any kind of Anglo-American alliance or alliance between the United States and Britain. Since Spain was starting to have more hostilities with Britain, they didn't want the United States to side with Britain. Since France was having more hostilities with Britain, Napoleon didn't want the United States to become an ally to Britain. And so instead, Napoleon signed over this land, hoping that the United States would say, okay, I would like France to be more of my ally instead of Britain. The Louisiana Purchase was probably the high point of Jefferson's presidency. Gaining all this land was a big deal in the United States, and it was seen at home as a diplomatic victory. That also avoided drawing the United States into conflict with the European powers. Aside from that being a high point for Jefferson's presidency, the Louisiana Purchase also essentially destroyed the Federalist Party. So, when James Monroe was able to accomplish what he set out to do, he went out under Jefferson's orders and tried to purchase New Orleans and West Florida. He was able to do this successfully. All relations with France were peaceful, and so it was seen as a diplomatic victory at home. Plus, doing this kept the United States out of conflict with the European powers. The United States didn't have to fight with Spain about the port of New Orleans, and now that France had acquired New Orleans, the United States wasn't going to have to fight with France over that port either, because now they owned that port. Then it also essentially destroyed the Federalist Party. So the Democratic Republicans already favored relations with France over Britain, and now they had more of an alliance with France because they had just had this nice diplomatic agreement. Then a lot of the New England states had Federalist Party members, but the states to the west and to the south tended to have more Democratic Republicans. Well, Jefferson bought even more land that extended further south and further west, which was going to acquire more Democratic Republican voters. So with all of these things happening, and with Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans having this shiny appearance to all of the people at this point after this victory, the Federalist Party was essentially done from this point onward. So the Louisiana Purchase was important for several reasons. It was the largest land acquisition without bloodshed in human history. It helped make sure that there were better diplomatic relations between the United States and France, and it kept the United States out of any problems with the European powers. And at least for the Democratic Republicans, there was the benefit that the Federalist Party was essentially destroyed after the Louisiana Purchase. Manifest destiny. The phrase manifest destiny is used to mean the inevitability and righteousness of the American expansion westward. It meant that America was destined to stretch across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. So during the early 1800s, a lot of Americans felt this way. They felt that it was destiny for America to stretch across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, that it was destined for America to keep expanding and cover as much of North America as possible. Some believed that this was destined by God, some just believed that it would be economically profitable, and so America should keep expanding. The phrase itself was coined by editor John O'Sullivan to promote the annexation of Texas and the Oregon Country. And the annexation would be if the United States annexed or took in Texas and the Oregon Country, if the United States made those part of America, and they would have to then either make them states or divide them up into states. The idea was lent further credence by the work of Horace Greeley, the journalist responsible for the admonition, "Go west, young man." Now, when Horace Greeley wrote this, he was saying, go west because in the west there is fertile land. You can go and make a life for yourself out there, as opposed to in the east where the big cities had a lot of poverty and a lot of unemployment. So westward expansion was seen as the solution to that problem. If you went west and were willing to work hard, you could make a life for yourself and you could have a much better life than you could living in the cities. So Manifest Destiny was coined by John O'Sullivan and was further promoted by Horace Greeley in his admonition, "Go west, young man." Now, besides this mythology of manifest destiny, there were some sound reasons why the United States expanded westward. There was cheap and fertile land in the West. The fertile farmland available in the United States proper, the area that had been divided by states and was well settled, that area was already claimed by people. So you would have to pay more money to get that farmland, and it would have already been used, so it may not be as fertile as it once was, where in the West there was land that hadn't been farmed yet. There was land that was cheap and fertile, and it could give you a good life if you were willing to go out there and work hard. In addition, the more land that was claimed by the Americans, the less there was that could be claimed by the British. So, even though the British wasn't supposed to be claiming any new land in the Americas, that was always a threat if there was land that had been unclaimed by any country. So if the Americans expanded westward and took over certain areas of land, that meant there was less land Britain could lay claim to. Americans also had an eye towards claiming western ports to begin trading with Asia. If they had ports along the western coast, they could sail straight across to Asia. They wouldn't have to go all the way across Europe to get to Asia, or just pay different amounts of money to the British, who could export goods from the Asian countries and then send them over to America. But Americans would be paying more money for that because they would have to travel further. If Americans could just have their own port cities, Asian countries could send their own ships over, sell their own goods to Americans directly, and Americans could also launch out of those western port cities and trade with the Asian countries. So the Americans did have an eye on getting western port cities built up. The fur trading industry, or fur trapping industry, made the Oregon country more appealing, and the discovery of gold in a California stream generated even more excitement over the economic potential of the West. So, people realized that trapping animals for their fur and trading and selling those furs was becoming more lucrative, and there were a lot of animals to be trapped in this open Oregon country. And then in California, gold was discovered in a stream, and this led to even more excitement over the economic potential of the West. They realized that there was gold to be had there was farming to be had there was fur trapping to be had there was a lot of economic potential in the West, and so that gave another sound reason to why Americans wanted to expand westward. And finally, many Americans felt that they would only be benefiting the world by spreading their ideas of liberty and democracy across as much land as possible. So some countries, especially in South America, had already identified with the United States. They had already declared their own independence, they had formed their own small countries, and they wanted to try to have a democracy like America did. They wanted to be free, they wanted their liberty, their personal liberties, and so other countries were already following America as a model. So now the Americans felt that they would only be benefiting the world if they brought their values, their ideals of liberty and democracy to other areas of the world. So if they spread across as much land as possible, promoting these ideals or spreading them as they spread the United States, basically, as they made the United States larger and encompassing more land, those values would be spread to those areas because they would be a part of the United States as well. So manifest destiny is the term used to describe the inevitability and righteousness of American expansion westward, of the American expansion across the continent to spread from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And it meant that this was going to happen, this was inevitable, and that the righteousness meant that it was destined to happen. This was a good thing. Many believed it was destined by God. Others believed it just should happen because of the economic potential there. The term was coined by John O'Sullivan to promote annexation of Texas and the Oregon country. The idea was given further credence by Horace Greeley whenever he admonished people, "Go west, young man," spreading the ideals of the West, saying that you could have a good life out there as opposed to the poverty and unemployment found in a lot of large eastern cities. Besides these ideas of manifest destiny, there were actual sound reasons for America to extend westward. There was cheap and fertile land. The more land America claimed, the less the British could claim. Americans wanted western port cities so they could trade with Asia. They also realized that there were a lot of lucrative industries to be had in the West, such as fur trapping and gold mining, in addition to having fertile land for farming. And then Americans wanted to continue to spread their ideals of liberty and democracy to as many lands as possible. The Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was a religious revival in New England in the 1730s and 40s. So people had lost their religious fervor in the late 1600s, and in the early 1700s it was starting to pick up, and the Great Awakening was a big mass movement in America where everyone was kind of renewing their religious fervor, I guess. They were more excited about religion. They took it on as a more personal goal, and they wanted to read and learn about it at home. They didn't just listen complacently. They actually wanted to be involved. And so this was a period when religion was on the rise. It began in response to the growing secularism. So people had been declining in how religious they were, and it was aided by the recent migrations into the cities, where it was easier for large crowds to form. If you live out in the middle of nowhere on a farm, it's not going to be easy to come across a large crowd. But if you live in a city or near a city, then you can join a large crowd and hear about all this all at once. And so people would travel to the cities to spread the word. They would have evangelists who would come to bring messages about God and try to convert people to Christianity, try to renew their Christian vows and make sure they were firmly established with their that they had been saved by Christ, that they were firmly secure in their position in heaven. And so these evangelists would travel to the big cities or any cities because that's where a large crowd could gather and they could talk to lots of people at once. Jonathan Edwards was one of the most famous preachers at this time. He wrote the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which is still, over 250 years later, analyzed as a religious document. People go back and look at his sermon and try to get a better idea of what life was like at the time of the Great Awakening, what the spirit was like of the people, what religion was like at that time for the people. And Jonathan Edwards' sermon gives them one of the clearest pictures they have. And he was one of those evangelists that traveled, and he had his home parish where he would preach, but he also had a route, and he would go and he would preach to crowds in other cities besides his home church. The Great Awakening was the first mass movement in America, and it helped break down the divides between the various regions of the British colonies and led to the formation of some new Protestant denominations. Protestant being any of those religions that were separate from the Catholic Church and the Church of England. So the Protestants were those who had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Church of England broke away from the Roman Catholic Church as well, but it still wasn't wholly Protestant. So Protestant was going to be people who weren't affiliated with either the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church. And so new denominations of Protestantism arose. And so each little denomination was going to believe something a little different, and that group of people would form a new denomination. This helped unite lots of people because it broke down the divides between different regions. If you had different colonies that had traditionally had ideas about what the other colony was like, or maybe they had competition among trading, anything that was going on that had put up a barrier between these two areas or multiple areas was mostly broken down during this period because everyone was coming together. They were hearing about how they should love their neighbor, and there was just this great religious, happy atmosphere during this period of Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s. So it helped break down barriers among different regions in the British colonies, and it helped people to form some new denominations. Though the revivalists did not directly advocate the abolition of slavery, so remember, everyone had slaves at this time. People in the South and people in the North, people in New England, had slaves. Now in New England, the slaves were usually going to be household servants and not be doing hard labor in the fields like on the southern plantations, but people did still own slaves. They were owning the other person, which many people did feel was wrong. Now, the revivalists, your evangelists, the people who were promoting religion at this time, didn't directly advocate the abolition of slavery. They weren't going around telling people, you need to get rid of your slaves. But they did suggest that there was divinity in all creation, and that therefore blacks were worthy of being converted to Christianity. And this was important because one of the ways that people had said slavery was okay was that they were saying they were less than white people. They were less than human, and that made it okay for white people to own the black people. Well, with the revivalists suggesting that divinity is in all creation and that the black people were worthy of being converted to Christianity, that was putting them somewhat on the same level with the white people. And so that was a step toward abolition of slavery, even if the revivalists weren't directly promoting that. So, the Great Awakening was a religious revival in the 1730s and 40s. It led to lots of revivals happening in the large cities where crowds could form. And it broke down some barriers between different regions in the British colonies. It gave everyone something that they kind of had in common. But they did also form some new denominations at this time. In general, this was just a time where after a decline in religious fervor, we now had a great uplifting of religious fervor in New England.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the author of the Declaration of Rights of Women. She spent her life working for the rights of women, especially the women's right to vote. Now, working with Lucretia Mott, who is a social reformer and another women's rights activist, she organized the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And there at the convention was where she wrote the Declaration of Rights. At the convention, she pushed the assembly to adopt a resolution. And this resolution would call for women to gain the right to vote. Now, in 1878, along with Susan B. Anthony, another women's rights activist, they wrote what would become the 19th Amendment. Now, it wasn't until 1920 this was officially ratified. However, it was written in 1878, which was a long time before that. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived from 1815 to 1902, so the 19th Amendment happened 18 years after her death. Stanton was an important thinker in the women's rights movement, in addition to being a wife and mother of 7 children.
Even today, 150 years after the start of the Civil War, scholars that study that era of American history often disagree about the specific causes that led to the beginning of the Civil War. However, there are generally 5 causes that resulted in the Southern states seceding from the Union and triggering the American Civil War. Now, those 5 causes are the following: slavery, states' rights, sectionalism, territorial crisis, and national elections. At this point, I want to focus on 2 of the 5 causes: slavery and sectionalism. Now, with sectionalism, it involves this idea that you have competing interests that have different economies, social structure, different customs, and political values. In the 1800s, those competing parts of the American Union were the states in the South and the states in the North. By the 1860s, before the Civil War begins, the American economy is still pretty much agrarian or agricultural based. However, in the North, states were beginning to expand their economies to include manufacturing and factories producing large quantities of products so that they could be shipped overseas to international markets. Now, the labor that these factories relied upon often included immigrant labor, and that labor was paid labor. Now, this was in contrast to the states in the South. The South was still pretty much an agricultural-based economy. And their major cash crops, that is, the crops that brought in the most money, the most value, included rice, indigo, cotton, tobacco, and sugar. And especially with these crops, it required a lot of manpower to conduct the harvesting of these crops. That meant that the Southern economy was extremely dependent on slavery. So much that slavery really became part of the way of life in the South. Now, in contrast, when we look at political values, the North had most of the abolitionist or anti-slavery sentiment, while the South was still pretty much pro-slavery. And because of these competing political values, the structure, and the different economies, the North becoming more manufacturing based, the South continuing to rely on a strong agricultural based economy, you had conflict. And this conflict eventually resulted in the states from the South seceding from the Union, forming the Confederacy, and triggering the beginning of the American Civil War.
Popular sovereignty. In addition to the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions that were present in the mid-1800s, a third group arose. They felt that each individual state should be allowed to decide whether to allow or ban slavery within its borders. And this idea was known as popular sovereignty. So each individual state would be allowed to decide if they were going to allow slavery or ban slavery, if they were going to be a slave state or a free state. And this was because there was a lot of pro-slavery and anti-slavery support going on, and the different groups were lobbying for different things to happen in Congress and with future laws, especially as this is a period where a lot of new states were joining the Union. It was right after the Mexican-American War, when the United States had gained a lot of land after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and so people were worried about what would happen in the future. And so the people who were somewhere in the middle of pro-slavery and anti-slavery decided that they should just leave it up to the individual states. The people who were living in these new areas that wanted to become states, they thought that they should get to decide whether that state was going to be a free state or a slave state. And that idea was known as popular sovereignty. So, when California applied to join the Union in 1849, the balance of congressional power was threatened again. During the Mexican-American War, there was a lot of worry in Congress about what would happen with all the new land. Would they be admitted as free states, or would they be admitted as slave states? And a lot of people said, oh, we don't want any more slave states, but the slave states didn't want there to only be free states, because then eventually they would be outnumbered and they wouldn't be able to get what they wanted done in Congress anymore. So with Texas, it was already done. And after the Mexican-American War, the United States had all this land, but it wasn't formed into states yet. So when California applied to join the Union as a state, it was going to have to decide whether to be a free state or a slave state, and all this turmoil came about again. The power the balance of power was threatened because California could be one or the other, and that was going to add a state to one side or the other. So, the Compromise of 1850 was drawn up, and it introduced a set of laws meant to end the conflict. So, these laws were compromises that both sides could agree upon. California was admitted as a free state. And the slave trade in Washington, D.C., where Congress met, was outlawed. So these were some concessions on the side of free states. California became a free state, slave trade in Washington, D.C. was outlawed, and efforts to capture escaped slaves were increased. So this is something that was going to tailor to the slave states. Slaves were escaping from the states where they were enslaved and traveling north, traveling to free states. And then once they got there, they were being allowed to be free, they were being protected, they were being fed, sheltered, helped to get further away from the slave states. And the slave states got in this compromise that efforts to capture and return those escaped slaves were going to be increased. So instead of people sheltering any escaped slaves, they were supposed to return them back to where they belonged, back to where their owners were. New Mexico and Utah would decide individually whether or not to allow slavery. So Mexico and Utah were given popular sovereignty. They were allowed to decide for themselves as a state, each one of them, whether they were going to allow or ban slavery. And even after the laws included in the compromise, fierce debate arose every time a new state planned to enter the Union. So they'd come up with some compromises, but every time a new state was going to enter the Union, there was going to be some worry. There was going to be a lot of debate because people didn't want either the free states or the slave states to gain too much power, to get too many states on their side. So there was always going to be that debate until finally, with the Civil War, slavery was banned forever. But popular sovereignty was simply part of the Compromise of 1850, which was enacted to help settle tensions between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions. And popular sovereignty just meant that individual states would have the right to decide for themselves as a state whether to allow slavery or to ban slavery from that state. The Missouri Compromise. In 1820, the territory called Missouri asked to enter the Union as a slave state. This would have made the number of slave states 12 compared to 11 free states. So at this time in the United States, a state was considered either a free state or a slave state. If the state allowed slavery, it was a slave state. If the state did not allow slavery, then it was a free state. So most of your free states were going to be up north, and most of your slave states were going to be down in the south because slavery was more prevalent in the south. Now, in 1820, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, so there were an even number for each side of this issue. So if Missouri had entered as another slave state, this would have given the slave states the upper hand when it came to voting for different things in Congress. There would be more people in favor of slavery than there were in favor of not having slavery, in favor of being a free state. So, rather than allow this to happen, James Talmadge proposed abolishing slavery in Missouri. So he said, okay, how about we just make Missouri a free state? If we make Missouri abolish slavery, Missouri enters as a free state, how about that? Well, that wouldn't have been a great solution for everyone because then there would have been 12 free states and only 11 slave states, so someone's still getting slighted there. So Henry Clay then offered another solution known as the Missouri Compromise. According to this proposal, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, but Maine would separate from Massachusetts and become a free state. So Massachusetts was already a free state. Maine at this time was part of Massachusetts. So in Henry Clay's compromise, Maine separated and became its own state, and it would enter as a free state. Missouri would enter as a slave state as it wanted, and that would change the number of both free states and slave states to 12. You'd have one of each being added, and so that was the compromise. It kept the number even. Each group would have the same number of states on the issue of slavery. But Missouri could still enter as a slave state as it had wanted to. Furthermore, everything south of Missouri would be slave territory, and everything above would be free. So the Missouri Compromise also lined out something for the future. In the future, anything south of Missouri would be considered slave territory, so if a state was to enter the Union from that area, it would be considered a slave state, and anything above Missouri would be free. So any states entering from above Missouri, any new states entering the Union would be free states. And this pretty much set a precedent as states were added, that there would generally be one slave state added for one free state. They wouldn't allow just one or the other to join, because then that would upset the balance in Congress. So they wanted to keep things even, and the Missouri Compromise kind of set the stage for that. Now, this compromise was satisfactory to pretty much everybody for several reasons, even though the proposed free lands were larger than slave lands. So you might think some would have a problem with this, especially because the proposed free lands north of Missouri were larger than the slave lands south of Missouri. But people had their reasons for being okay with this compromise. This was because most agreed that slavery could not be successful in colder climates. So if you move up north, it gets colder. And people thought, you know what, slavery's not going to be that successful up north anyway, so it's okay if everything north of Missouri is going to be a free state, because slavery wouldn't work there very well anyway. Most of the slaves are working on large plantations. Large plantations aren't going to be able to grow for as many months out of the year further north where it's colder. So this wasn't really something that was going to work as well up north, so they were fine with that area being free. Additionally, many thought that Texas would soon be a part of the United States. Texas was a very large area of land, and it would mostly be south of Missouri. So people thought, okay, Texas will join the Union soon, and then we'll have all that land in an additional state or multiple states that will be considered slave states, more slave territory. So everyone was okay with this because slavery wasn't going to work as well up north anyway, and the South thought, okay, we'll be getting more land soon anyway, so it doesn't matter if right now the free lands are larger than the slave lands. So the Missouri Compromise was a solution that Henry Clay came up with in response to Missouri's request to join the Union as a slave state, which would have offset the balance and made the United States have 12 slave states to 11 free states. The compromise included Missouri getting to enter as a slave state at the same time that Maine separated from Massachusetts and became a free state. And it also clarified for the future that anything south of Missouri would be slave territory and anything north of Missouri would be free territory.
Today we want to go over just some of the basics related to the conflict between the North and the South that resulted in the war between the states, or the Civil War, in the 1800s, 1861 to 65. And when we think about this, often it's taught in very flat, basic terms, and things, as we know in the real world, are often much more complicated. But the basic conflict between the North and the South was not merely slavery. They had many differences, and these differences found perhaps a focal point in slavery, but there were other things as well. And so I want to go through just a few of those basic differences that led to the conflict between them that eventually precipitated out into the Civil War. First, when we think about the conflict between the North and the South, we need to think in terms of economic differences. The economy in the North and the economy in the South were based on very different things. The Northern economy was much more diversified. It had small individual farms run by individuals, and it had an industrial base. The South, by contrast, was almost uniformly economic in terms of agrarian needs. They had large-scale plantations as well as individual farms, but the economy was run on growing cash crops like cotton and tobacco, and basically you needed a lot of manpower to make that work. When we think in terms also of economics, we need to think in terms of population density. The population in the North was much more dense. There were more people in the North. The South was spread out with fewer people. And the majority of the people in the South were slaves in this case. So in terms of economics, you've got a difference in population density, a difference in focus, more diverse in the North, much more uniform in the South. And when that comes into play, then you start making people worried. If you start taking away their source of labor, you're basically threatening their livelihood. Now we're going to get to the question of morality down here below, but just in terms of economics, part of the way the South saw things was, hey, if you change things and you abolish slavery, you're actually going to destroy our economy and our livelihood and our way to make money. We don't have anything else to fall back on. So that was part of the issue then, was economic differences. Industrial and diversified in the North, agrarian in the South, large-scale plantations, cotton and tobacco primarily. Next, when we think about the conflict between the North and the South, it needs to be seen as a power issue, a political power issue. So on the federal level, what the South was hoping for was equality. Now, if the federal level is run by representation that's based on population, and there's more population in the North and less population in the South, then the South is going to say, hey, wait a minute, you're always going to get your way because you're going to have more representation because you have more population. We'd like to equalize that. And the way we're going to equalize that is we want our slave populations counted for purposes of representation. And taxation is also based on population. In that case, the South would say we don't want to be taxed on our slave population, just on our landowning population. And so the compromise that worked out, which has been called the 3/5 compromise, basically 3 out of every 5 slaves counted for purposes of representation and taxation. It was a way to boost taxation from the South, and also for the South to boost representation on the federal level. Basically, the South saw this, though, as we want political equality on the federal level so you don't lord it over us and get your way and we have no say in it. But on the local level, the South very much wanted autonomy. We don't want you telling us what to do. On the local level, leave us alone. It's been said that almost every day Robert E. Lee woke up during the Civil War, looked across the lines at the North and said, I wish those people over there would go home and leave us alone. It wasn't a war of conquest on behalf of the South. They wanted to be left alone. So, economic differences, political differences, power differences, equality on the federal level, autonomy on the local level, and then we get to the whole question here of morality. And this was a big one. To those in the North, and I think to those of us today, we would say that slavery is very much a moral issue before it's ever an economic or a power issue. It's a moral issue, one human being owning another. Now, it's easy to be anachronistic here and say, well, viewed from today, we know they're wrong. If you can get, though, into their mindset of their day, this is how they thought about it. The abolitionists in the North said it's immoral and wrong, and here's our reasoning. Those who were pro-slavery in the South weren't trying to argue that, hey, we think this is indifferent morally. They actually, as a Christian culture largely, at least a Christian culture on the surface, said that the Bible nowhere condemns slavery, and if we abide by its injunctions on how we treat our slaves, we're well within morality. That's obviously easily debated, but from those in the North, the abolitionists, the standpoint was clear. It's immoral, therefore it needs to end. We don't care if it crushes your economy or if we have to do it through force of political power. It's immoral. And I think there was in the South at least a sense of fear of, well, if you've got the moral argument, then these arguments, which are important to us, hold no sway. And so it led to the inevitable conflict, I think, in some ways. But this is very much a part of this question and part of the conflict between the North and the South. And then finally, when you think in terms of social structure, the North and the South were very different socially. The North was much more egalitarian. It had much more influx of peoples from all sorts of different areas, and even though there would obviously be squabbles between them, by and large, they were more egalitarian in their culture. everyone had equal opportunity, could rise as far as their ability allowed, more or less. And that's sort of their mindset, was egalitarian. The South was much more stratified, much more hierarchical, much more like Britain in that sense. That everyone had a class. You were born into a certain class, you needed to know your place and keep your place. And if you were a slave, you were at the bottom of the bucket, and it went from there on up to the landed aristocracy, the landowners, basically. I'm not arguing the rightness and wrongness of that. I'm just saying that that was part of the differences that led to the conflict and why they were that way. More or less egalitarian, much more stratified and hierarchical in their view of things. These sorts of differences and many more all flowed together into that volatile time leading to that conflict. So it wasn't just a flat, easy read of, hey, the South was immoral and liked slaves, and the North was moral and hated slaves, and that's why they fought. It was issues related to economic differences, political power differences, social structure differences, and yes, differences in how they saw the moral question related to slavery. Well, this has just been a brief overview then of some of the issues related to the conflict between the North and the South. It's much more complex than we can possibly cover in this brief video, but I wanted to highlight those for us and then encourage you to study further. If you'd like to know more about this or related matters, underneath this video you'll see a link. If you'll click on that link, it'll take you to the website that has that information, and while you're on that website you'll also find a link to an ebook that's ready for immediate download.
About 150 years ago, from 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War occurred. Now, anytime there's a civil war, that's because there are warring factions or different sides that claim allegiance to the same country. In the case of the American Civil War, the warring factions included the Confederacy or the Southern states versus the Union or the Northern states. Now, there is a disagreement between scholars that study the Civil War period about the specific causes that led to the South seceding or leaving the Union and triggering the Civil War. However, generally, there is consensus about 5 causes that led to the beginning of the Civil War. Those causes include slavery, sectionalism, territorial crisis, national elections, and states' rights. Now, the American Civil War, as all civil wars, was and still is today our most bloody conflict. The American Civil War resulted in at least 600,000 deaths. And that's 600,000 deaths on both sides, North and South. And because most of the Civil War was fought in the South, it literally left many Southern states and communities devastated. Now, when we look at the Civil War from a military standpoint, we're primarily looking at 2 personalities. In the South, we had Robert E. Lee. By far, Robert E. Lee was one of the South's most able military commanders. Now, Robert E. Lee started off as the commander of the Army of Virginia, which was by far the South's largest unit and from the South's probably most prominent state, Virginia. Eventually, Lee would be promoted to Commander-in-Chief of Confederate forces. Then for the North, you had General Ulysses S. Grant. At the beginning of the Civil War, Lincoln, who was the president at that time, had to go through many generals in order to find one that could actually come up with a strategy to defeat the South and bring the Union back together. Eventually, Lincoln would settle on Grant. He would be promoted to be commander of all Union forces, and eventually he became the 18th president of the United States. Now, looking at the Civil War, there were many battles. Some historians would say that there was an and there was an engagement during the Civil War nearly every day from 1861 to 1865. But we see here in 1860, Lincoln was elected. The South is beginning to realize that because of their economic position, which is translating to their political position, they are losing a lot of influence in the United States when it comes to national elections. Now, 1861, Southern forces fire on Fort Sumter, where there are Union forces located. This signals the beginning of the Civil War in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. By 1863, we have this great battle in Pennsylvania called the Battle of Gettysburg. There were many casualties, and this battle was a signal of the tide turning from the South to the North, an eventual victory by 1865 at the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, where Lee surrenders to Grant and the Civil War ends.
Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order issued by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. And this was not something done by Congress. This was done solely by President Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So it did have a certain weight whenever he proclaimed all of this, but it wasn't, only Congress could declare war, and so it wasn't actually Congress saying it, it was just an executive order from President Lincoln. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation freed all slaves in Confederate states that had not ceased rebellion by the beginning of the year. So, Lincoln had issued a pre-proclamation. He had said, I will be issuing a proclamation on the first of the year. If by the time that January 1st rolls around, you haven't stopped rebelling, you haven't come back and joined the Union, then you will be subject to this proclamation. And he told all of the states that in September. So they had a few months to decide this, but the Confederate states that hadn't ceased rebellion were supposed to be under the jurisdiction of the Emancipation Proclamation. So what it said was that all the slaves in those Confederate states were free now. It effectively freed them. The proclamation stated that suitable ex-slaves, also known as freedmen, could join the paid service of the United States Armed Forces. So they had to be suitable. They pretty much only took men, and they were going to want healthy, younger men that could actually do some fighting. So suitable ex-slaves could join. They could be paid to be part of the Union Army. Lincoln ordered the Union Army to recognize and maintain the freedom of all freedmen who joined. So even though it's the Union Army, there were still going to be some people who didn't think that these people that had just been slaves a couple months before should be fighting with them. So he ordered the army to make sure that their freedom was recognized and maintained, because he was serious about this. And because Lincoln was freeing them and giving them the option to fight and be paid to do so, several of the freedmen did join the armed services. Almost 200,000 black men fought in the Union Army, and approximately 10,000 served in the Navy. So this added a lot to the number of soldiers and the size of the army that Lincoln commanded. So they really helped in the war effort. And similarly, the South had lost a lot of the people that had lived there. They lost a lot of their population because even if they didn't follow the Emancipation Proclamation and let their slaves go, a lot of slaves would escape and get over state lines into free states, into what was considered the Union, and then they would be free. And then a lot of them would go and fight against the South for the Union Army. The proclamation also set a precedent for the emancipation of slaves as the war progressed. So as they moved steadily south and they started to control more southern areas, they would free the slaves in those areas. And it showed that ending slavery was a goal of the Union war effort. Lincoln started out just wanting to get the Union back together. Slavery was a big issue, but it wasn't all that they were fighting for. He just wanted to get the Union back together. The South were saying, no, we're going to rebel because we want to keep our slaves. The North was saying, well, we don't like you keeping your slaves, but we still want you to be part of the Union. The Confederate States said, no, we'll just make our own country and we'll have our slaves over here. And Lincoln wanted to prevent that. He wanted to keep the country together. And so that was what the primary goal was in the beginning. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, a huge goal became freeing all of the slaves and abolishing slavery. So that is all that the Emancipation Proclamation did do. Now, the proclamation did not free any slaves under Union control. So if there were some Confederate states that did go back under Union control by their deadline of January 1st. And the slaves in those states were not freed. They were still allowed to be kept as slaves until the end of the war. And so the Emancipation Proclamation did not actually abolish slavery. It didn't get rid of slavery altogether. It only got rid of slavery in the Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union. There was that goal of emancipating slaves as they moved south and, in the end, abolishing slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation did not do that. It only abolished slavery and freed the slaves in the Confederate states that were not under Union control. And the proclamation did not make ex-slaves citizens. So yes, they were free, but they were not U.S. citizens yet. The Emancipation Proclamation did a lot in terms of moving forward the goal of emancipating slaves, and it enforced that freeing the slaves is going to be a major goal of the Civil War and on the northern side. And so that is why it was so important. President Abraham Lincoln showed that he wasn't messing around with the slavery issue. If the Union couldn't be returned to one whole country, then he was going to free all the slaves in the South and end this slavery thing for good. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation didn't end slavery for good. That didn't happen until the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution after the Civil War. But the proclamation did spur people to all unite under the goal in the North, and as far as the Union went, to end slavery. The Union decided ending slavery is one of our goals now. As we move through the South, we are going to free slaves. Where the Confederate was just trying to hang on to their slaves and maintain themselves as a new country. So the Emancipation Proclamation was very important in terms of reestablishing the goal of the Civil War as freeing slaves as the Union was reunited.
Robert E. Lee is known as the commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. When, in 1861, the Civil War first broke out, President Lincoln offered Lee command of the Union Army, but Lee declined because his home state, Virginia, was threatening to secede from the Union. So originally, Robert E. Lee was asked to serve on the Union side of the Civil War, but he ended up being a general or a commander on the Confederate side. Now, when the Confederacy was established, Lee became a senior military advisor to President Jefferson Davis, because Jefferson Davis was president of the Confederacy while Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. Now, Lee led many great battles, but was unable to ever invade the North, and so he ended up surrendering in 1865. And so that's an important date to remember. The war started in 1861 and then ran until 1865. So it lasted 4 years, but it's popularly noted that it lasted 5 Aprils. And so when Lee surrendered, that's kind of known as the beginning of the end of the Confederacy, because within 2 months, the rest of the Confederate armies had also surrendered.
Reconstruction. There were a few different aspects to Reconstruction after the Civil War in the United States. First, we have presidential Reconstruction. And this has to do with what the president has control over. So presidential construction was largely driven by President Andrew Jackson's policies. Lincoln had not gotten to do too much with Reconstruction before his assassination. So the primary policies for presidential Reconstruction came from Andrew Jackson. And he was lenient on the South and allowed continued discrimination and control over blacks. So presidential Reconstruction really wasn't helping to reconstruct. President Andrew Jackson just quickly wanted to say, okay, everything's reconstructed, we can be one union again, everything's over, everything's good. But that wasn't really the case. Next we have congressional Reconstruction. And this has to do with how Congress handled Reconstruction. Congress was controlled mainly by radical Republicans during this period, and they provided more civil rights for blacks and wanted more control over the Southern government. Basically, Congress wasn't ready to forgive and let the Southern governments go back to doing just what they'd been doing before. They were worried that the South would try to reinforce slavery or still keep African Americans in a lower condition or lower position than they were in. And they were right in a sense, because that did continue for a long time. The radical Republicans were just ones who were very seriously pro African Americans and anti-South. They wanted the South to be punished. They wanted to hold more control over the South to make sure they could be trusted before they were left on their own. So this was marked by military control of former Confederate state governments. So again, Congress that was made up of these radical Republicans were still worried about what the South might do if they were given free reign and could have their governments functioning however they wanted. So they have military control of these former Confederate state governments. And Congress was responsible for the Reconstruction Amendments, which were adopted from 1865 to 1870. Those were the 5 years directly following the Civil War. And so they worked to get these amendments passed. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation had granted freedom to slaves in Confederate states that were rebelling against the Union, but it didn't free all slaves. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and freed all slaves. The 14th Amendment included the privileges and immunities, due process, and equal protection clauses. So it was giving them more civil rights, more rights as U.S. citizens. And the 15th Amendment granted voting rights regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So again, more civil rights, but specifically voting rights to all men, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This didn't give voting rights to women, only to men, and it could be for black or white men. And the promises of these amendments were worn away by state laws in the South and federal court decisions that upheld the state's laws and went against what these constitutional amendments were giving the new black citizens. So states passed what were known as the Jim Crow laws, which limited the rights of African Americans. And so it made it hard for them to be able to vote. It made it hard for them to have the same rights and privileges as white men did at that time. Now they were free, but they were still pushed into a lower position than white people. They weren't treated the same way. They weren't given the equal treatment that they should have been given under these Reconstruction amendments. And then finally, the last part of Reconstruction is known as redemption, which presumes that the South was redeemed and had lived up to any conditions it needed to live up to and could now be accepted back into the Union. So the Confederate States were gradually readmitted to the Union. And white Democrats took over most Southern governments. And the last troops left the South in 1877. So this is considered the last year of Reconstruction because it was when redemption was achieved. The last Union troops that had military control over those former Confederate states, they left, they retreated, and went back to their homes up north. So no more troops were there to control the governments. White Democrats swept across and took over most of the Southern governments and continued to oppress new black citizens. And the Confederate States were gradually readmitted to the Union. So they were considered redeemed, allowed back in with all the rights that they had previously as states in the Union. Now, black citizens were still going to be discriminated against for the years to come until the 1960s, when they actually were given their full rights and people were forced to acknowledge those instead of just ignoring them. The Jim Crow laws were overturned and considered unconstitutional themselves during the 1960s. But during Reconstruction, the Reconstruction amendments were passed, giving the new black citizens more rights in name. They just didn't get them in act yet. And the Southern governments were slowly rebuilt until they were allowed to function on their own, and that was known as redemption, which ended the period known as Reconstruction.
ACT, Science Data Representation. Almost all maps have a key, which contains listings for all the important symbols on the map. Now, another name for a key is a legend. And so you'll find the key or legend oftentimes in the right-hand corner of the map, many times in a box just like that. And so this legend or key is going to define the symbols on the map for various landmarks. Of course, these symbols will vary depending on the nature of the map. And so a road map will have different colored lines in the legend indicating roads, highways, and interstates. It'll also contain dots and circles and squares indicating towns of different population. So this dot right here may represent a town of 25,000 or less, and a dot with a circle around it may represent a town of 50,000 or less, and a square represents a town of 100,000 or less. Now, the legend may also contain information about the map's scale. So it may say something like 1 inch equals 100 miles. However, the scale may be located somewhere else on the map. And many legends will also contain special symbols, maybe like a picnic table to indicate a campground, or a slide to represent a playground. So again, a key contains listings of all the important symbols on the map. And so this is going to vary for different types of maps. So the symbols I put in here would be for road maps, but another type of map would find other symbols more important.
Often when we study history, we analyze events as they occur in time. This process of arranging events in the order that they occurred in time is called chronology. In history, a tool that we use to put those events in order and show when they happened is called a timeline. Again, a timeline is a common way of showing when events occur. Now, right here, I have an example of a timeline. Now, this timeline addresses the major early battles of the American Revolution. Now, the first year of the American Revolution was 1775. So I have on my timeline here 1775 listed, and obviously the year after 1775 was 1776. I have the months listed, and to keep the timeline neat, I only list 5 of the months during that year. And then I identify 4 battles that occurred during 1775. So for example, there were 2 battles, the first 2 battles of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. Now those 2 battles occurred in April. And because they occurred in April, I have March listed here, shown here on the timeline. But since those 2 battles occurred in April, I have them listed just to the right of March, which indicates that they happened in April. Then Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill occurred in June. I have Bunker Hill listed right over June. Siege of St. John. It occurred in September. I have it listed right over September. Now, there are 2 ways of expressing or showing chronology. One way is called absolute chronology. Now, with absolute chronology, the term absolute means exact, right on. So with absolute chronology, we're looking at when events happen on a day, a month, or a year. In other words, absolute chronology is based on a calendar. Another type of chronology is relative chronology. Now, with relative chronology, we look at events located relative to each other. So with absolute chronology, we were looking at a calendar. With relative chronology, we're looking at relationships. We're looking at when events happen as they relate to each other. So for example, when event X happens, event Y occurs. When event Y occurs, event Z happens. So with chronology, it's arranging events in the order that they occurred in time. Often we will use a timeline as a common way of showing when events occur. The 2 types of chronology, absolute chronology, dealing with days, months, years, and relative chronology, which looks at how events occur and happen relative to each other.